Sarah, Chair Khan, this is Flo Khan. I apologize, I will not be on video for the first half an hour to 45 minutes, but I'm here.
Great. And Chair, we have enough for a quorum and we're broadcasted live. So at 9, you can call the meeting to order.
All right, thank you. It is 9 a.m. So we can call the meeting to order. Thanks everybody for joining in. So our first item on the agenda is public comment. Do we have any public comment from the North? Please keep in mind there are 3 minutes for each person for public comment. Anybody in the North?
Chair, we first have to call roll call.
Oh, that's right. I missed the roll call.
Good morning,
Can you call
everybody.
that?
I'll start with our voting commissioners. Dr. Khan,
Present?
Dr. Barron,
Here.
Teresa Bohannon,
Here.
Babette Bond,
Present.
Flo Khan,
Here.
Yarleni Roa Dugan,
Here.
Dr. Slonim,
Here.
Mason Van Howling,
Here.
and moving on to our advisory commission members, Justin Prajak,
Here.
Barbara Richardson,
Here.
Richard Whitley,
Here.
and Jessica Flood, Commissioner Jessica Flood and Commissioner Sean Shane are both absent and excused. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes our roll call and we have a quorum.
Thank you. Is Greg online today? The attorney?
Yes.
I'm here, Chair Khan.
All right, Greg, thanks. All right.
Mr. Chair,
public
this is
comment.
Commissioner Shaner. I'm here for the record. I apologize for
Oh,
that.
Sean, good to see you. So how about
All right.
public comment from the North? Anybody there?
Hold on, Chair Khan. Let me just see. Okay, attendees, if you are on the line now, if you can indicate that you'd like to speak, go ahead and either raise your hand virtually or press *9 to raise your hand if you're participating on the phone. Okay, I have one person. Hold on.
All right, please identify yourself. Please identify yourself if you have a comment to make in the public comment in the North.
Mr. Tom Clark, this is your time. Okay, bear with me, Chair. Let me try. Mr. Tom Clark, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Great.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tom Clark. I represent the Nevada Association of Health Plans. I want to talk briefly today about the PPC's bill, Senate Bill 40, and an amendment that was brought forward by a unique coalition of folks. The amendment was written and worked hard on by the Nevada Association, or Nevada Association of Health Plans, Nevada Hospital Association, Nevada State Medical Association, and the PCMA. The amendment is not intended to erode the hard work of the PPC. Rather, it's intended to bolster this legislation so that the mechanisms build and manage the APCD, the All Payer Claims Database, the data that's collected, and the final outcome is a product that can help set health policy for now and then. So, Mr. Chairman, I know that this is an agenda item that you have later on today, and we hope that you would consider the amendment that was brought forward by this coalition. Thank you.
We are losing you.
Okay, next caller, Mr. Bill Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Bill Welch for the record, President CEO of the Nevada Hospital Association. Like Mr. Clark, I also want to acknowledge that we had submitted an amendment at the hearing of Senate Bill 40 and just reiterate that the Nevada Hospital Association fully supports the passage of SB 40. And as Mr. Clark indicated, our amendment is intended to help strengthen and ensure a quality APCD that will be implemented and will be comparable with other APCDs that have been developed across the country. Secondly, on your agenda today, you have item number 7, which is an introduction to the cost growth benchmark. This program, the Peterson Milbank Program for Sustainable Healthcare Costs, I think it's a great opportunity for Nevada. We look forward to working with the Patient Protection Commission and other stakeholders. We think it's very important to understand the drivers of healthcare costs and how they impact the cost of healthcare in the state of Nevada. And again, we look forward to working with the PPC and other stakeholders on that very important study. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
No, that concludes public comment. Chair, I think you're frozen. Perhaps you can disable your video so that the connection might be a little bit stronger. Okay, it looks like we're going to need to take a pause for a moment while our chair reconnects. Thank you guys for waiting. I just got off the phone with our chair. It's going to be a little bit longer, but he's going to be dialing in now.
Thank you, Sarah.
Hello? Hello?
Chair Khan, hi, Chair Khan, you're back on.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about this high-tech, this stuff. Okay,
okay.
go ahead. So we
And
left.
Chair
where
Khan,
did we-
if you would like, for the remainder of this meeting, you can designate another member to facilitate the meeting in case there is a technical issue for the remainder of the meeting. Is that correct?
I think, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if you'd like to do that, just out of an abundance of caution, you do have that option.
I think Howard, is it all right if you could do that, if there's a glitch?
Sure.
Dr.
Just Sarah, just
Barrett,
let me know if I need to jump.
Okay.
Great. I think that there is a technicality that you may need to make it in the form of a motion and have the commissioners have an opportunity to object. Greg, is that correct?
So this is Greg. I wouldn't call it a motion because it's not agendized for action. I would say that since we're just kind of accommodating a technical difficulty, it'd be good to let the commissioners object if anybody doesn't think that Howard would be a benevolent leader.
No objection.
No objection.
Okay, you're good.
All
Okay,
right,
great, thanks.
good enough. So let us proceed. I think we were at the approval of minutes section, if I'm not mistaken. Item number 3 for possible action.
This
Do we
is
have a
Commissioner
motion
Manning.
to
I'd like to
approve
make a
minutes?
motion to approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
Second, this is Tony.
All right, any opposed? The motion carries. The next item, opening remarks by the chair. I really don't have any detailed remarks except that I would like to, as you're probably aware, one of the commissioners, John Packham, submitted his resignation from the commission. I personally would like to thank him for his service to this commission, and certainly his expertise will be missed by us on this commission. So that's really my only remark. The other comment I have is we have some discussion items over here. We have like to see if each item moves at like 15 minutes timing, hopefully, then we can move on to the presentation, which is about 2 hours, including the question answer, as I'm assured by the presenters. So we can move on to the item number 5, discussion on commissioner identified priorities. So Dr. Packham is not here, so I think we could eliminate that if that's okay with the commission and go on to item number B, Commissioner Bohannon, discussion on creation of PPC subcommittees. Is Commissioner Bohannon on?
I'm here.
All right, Commissioner Bohannon, would you like to give your comments on that?
Sure. And I don't need 15 minutes. I just thought that it might be worth revisiting the formation of subcommittees, mostly because I feel that my role is quite limited right now on this commission. And so I think that if we had some subcommittee work, it might provide some additional opportunities to kind of move along some of the, the challenges facing patients in our state and obviously nationally. I don't necessarily have any specific ideas on how many subcommittees we need or what they could be around topic areas, but it seems to me at the very least that we might have one or have at least 2, and for them to maybe mirror the priorities that we decide upon as a commission. With that, I think I'll yield my time back to hear from other commissioners about what they feel, how they feel about subcommittees and what it might look like in terms of how often we meet and, that's sort of the logistics of it. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. So I think, Sarah, if you would follow a routine process of identifying one commissioner at a time, if they have any input in that regard.
Sure, Chair. Dr. Barron?
Yeah, I was interested, Teresa, and you mentioned kind of an idea for this that and with some of our priorities in mind, and I guess I was wondering if you maybe flesh that out a little bit more and could tell us, like, for example, one or 2 areas in which you were personally interested in priorities that we had outlined, or how you would sort of see this going. And I would sort of reserve my comment for a little bit more detail from what you were thinking.
Sure.
All right.
Did you want me to respond, Chair, or just kind of
might as
wait?
well. Might as well.
Okay. I think workforce development was something that we all landed on. that's also the next agenda item. So that makes perfect sense to me to have a subcommittee around workforce development. I think that the language that Dr. Slonim put together, I thought was a really good starting point. I also see the subcommittees as being an opportunity to be more information sharing and data collection, where we can, maybe invite more presentations in and have that kind of us be sort of the subcommittees taking in a lot of information and then maybe having a standing agenda item where it's presented back. As the patient advocate, I would always, I would love to see a subcommittee just around healthcare costs and barriers to accessing healthcare. I think that's, that's going to be an ongoing issue for the foreseeable future. So those were the two immediate ones that I saw. And then obviously we can discuss other topics. Does that answer your question, Dr. Barron?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think the idea is generally a good idea. One or two fears I have is that I remember when we were talking about this, gosh, like literally a year ago, and I think we initially voted in favor of it. Then the COVID shutdown hit, and we basically sort of reoriented what we were doing at that point, and skipped a couple months of meetings, and then kind of all got together starting in about June or May again of last year. I remember one concern I had was that all of the topics were sort of really content-rich topics that we were talking about splitting up into groups for, and I was nervous that in doing so, number one, it would be hard to coordinate schedules and meet the open meeting laws and things like that. Doing let's say 3 or 4 subcommittees over the course of a month plus our general group meeting, then I guess I have fear of missing out really badly, and I didn't want to not be involved in something like that. For example, cost of healthcare discussions would be near and dear to my heart, but maybe Medicaid was a higher priority in my mind for me, or something like that. And so I was a little bit nervous about not getting input from all of the stakeholders in the commission on some of these things. And so those were, I guess, maybe my trepidations about the splitting up into subcommittees. I think the principle, however, is a good idea, and I'll leave it at that at my comments.
All right, who's the next one to comment?
Dr. Slonim?
Thank you, Chair Khan. Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Bohannon. I am feeling a little bit like a sense of urgency to do more as a part of PPC, and I think subject to the concerns of Dr. Barron, we can certainly manage within the context, but I'm anxious to get up and go on some of these topics. We got some big, heady things facing us, especially now in the air. We had them before, they're accentuated now. Workforce, costs, access, equity, on and on and on. I could just keep going in terms of how, and maybe it would help us to launch further and more deliberately into some of the work that we have ahead of us. So I'm all for it and would love to participate. Maybe we can even think about, to Howard's point, scheduling PPC so that we're not interfering, but we've had such long gaps in timeline between us meeting, you kind of feel out of the loop unless you're actually doing something and contributing. So I'm all for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Babette Bond?
Well, I'm glad that we're raising this topic today. I appreciate it. I appreciate Commissioner Bohannon's concerns about feeling a little not stuck, but like there's things that sit and are not getting addressed that were part of our original mission. So I support the idea that we would make more progress. And am I echoing? Good. And if subcommittees are something that we could manage, I agree with Dr. Barron that I think the barrier was it was going to take a lot of time for someone to organize and then manage those open meeting law requirements. So I think we originally considered 3 committees, and I supported all of those. And I think if we restructure the idea of committees into different topics, I'd probably be supportive of that as well. as long as the open meeting laws and our capacity to figure out who wants to be in what works. Maybe after the legislative session, we for sure will have more time. But I am not sure, honestly, Sarah, how that would work with the current initiative that you're rolling out now. So I guess I would say, if we're going to do subcommittee work, if it's in addition to this project that you're about to get us involved in, which I'm excited about, we would need to be careful about selecting the topics, about how we have capacity for more. So I'm like a reserved, it sounds good. My concerns are how would we do it with this other work, and which would be the topics, and how would we allocate people to those topics. But I don't have any opposition to that. I think it's true. Healthcare is huge, and there are not that many topics that we've been able to tackle. I would actually, can I say one more thing? If we're going to proceed, I would think that as executive director, Sarah might be in the best position to take what we've already asked for and create topics that we could then discuss, because I think they do need to coordinate with the rest of this work we're hearing today.
So if I hear you correctly, Bobbitt, are you suggesting that we hold on to the committee assignments till this presentation part and our discussion on that and deliberations take place, or we should have a parallel track?
I'm suggesting, I feel like Commissioner Bohannon is suggesting a parallel track, and I'm supportive of that, but they do need to coordinate. I think that we do need to not start a whole new big chapter if we don't have everything we need for this initiative locked down and scheduled, and I'm not aware if this requires subcommittees. So I think probably we just need to see the whole body of work and then set priorities for additional committee work before we approve new committees.
All right, thank you. Next commissioner online.
Commissioner Flo Khan.
Is Commissioner Khan online? Are you muted? Commissioner Khan, are you muted by any chance?
I can circle back to her, Chair.
Okay.
Mason?
Hi, good morning. Yes, I'm very supportive of this agenda item from the beginning. As many of us know, especially with a large body, with such a large charge, I think a lot of the work is actually done in the subcommittees. It could be very productive. And so, by the way, we've got great non-voting staff dedicated to this initiative as well, this commission. So I would propose 3 committees. I believe we'll be able to do it. Access and affordability, really looking at continuing to reduce the uninsured population here in the state of Nevada, even though we're one of the larger states, larger uninsured states that actually expanded Medicaid. Could really help focus on the minority and underserved, which I've heard from the beginning from all of our presentations. I think quality and advocacy as well. The opening remarks that we hear from patients looking and seeking our help is important, and maybe that's an avenue for a subcommittee to do some important work. And I agree, we've talked about workforce development, and trying to attract talent and retain in the state is an important one. So I definitely believe this group can divide and conquer and report up in a way that we all trust each other, that we're all working towards the same goals and mission, but also create some voting opportunities to keep things moving a little bit quicker in between our PPC commission meetings. So again, I'm very supportive of this, and I think it would be far more productive. And I think many of us have worked on employment or other commissions, other bodies, other boards, and this is where the work is done and then presented to the entire group. So very supportive of that.
All right, thank you, Mason. Next, Commissioner Sarah.
Okay, let's try Commissioner Flo Khan again.
Don't see her on the screen unless she's on the telephone.
Yeah, it looks like she is connecting and then reconnecting. So I will pause and let's go to Commissioner Yarleni Roa Dugan.
Yes, I actually want to wait for my turn to discuss my priority because it kind of goes together, if that's okay.
So help me understand. If you're, can we just narrow the committees down while we are at it, if you don't mind? If that is your thought that we should have subcommittees, you can include your consideration of priorities into those committees, if that's your recommendation.
Okay, do you want me to just then go to my point and speak?
Yeah, on the subcommittees, and if your priorities blend into your suggestions for subcommittees, that would cover it.
Yeah. So yes, I am in support of creating a subcommittee, and my suggestion is one for workforce issues and development, as well as patient engagement and advocacy, and the third one, healthcare costs and accessibility.
Oh, okay, great. Next, please.
Commissioner Sean Shaner.
Thank you. I would fully support the creation of subcommittees with respect to the areas that Commissioner Van Houweling outlined. I think it'll allow us to have more substantive discussion, smaller group setting, and report back to the larger commission on a regular basis. So I would fully support that.
Thank you. Next, Commissioner.
Okay, let's go back to Commissioner Flo Khan.
Sorry, Sarah, can you hear me?
I can.
Sorry, I apologize. I had an issue with the Zoom, but I guess my only issue, and this goes back to, I believe, Commissioner Barron's comments just about capacity and just better understanding specifically what the role of the subcommittee is going to do, the outline of what the subcommittees are going to be, and then is it just going to be available to commissioners to participate? Or are we going to have others as alternatives being available? Are we going to, is it just going to be like them looking at stuff and then bringing us back to the whole of the commission, ideas, recommendations on whatever the subcommittee topic is? And the only reason why I bring that up is as many of us are in the legislative session right now and trying to deal with that, as well as the work of the commission, just a capacity issue becomes really critical in terms of, being able to coordinate schedules and participate, because there are topic areas that I know personally I'd like to participate in, but my capacity is very limited. And so just trying to better understand the role and then what the requirements or needs are going to be of each of the commissioners.
So if I may answer that, traditionally and historically in other similar setups, subcommittees are created to address certain subjects. For example, Mason outlined 3 subjects. And if, for example, if there's a consensus around those subjects and those committee development, then obviously Sarah will send out requests for those interested in which committees, and that takes time. By the time commissioners submit their interests on which committees they want to serve, then we'll, in the next meeting or meeting thereafter, we will be establishing those committees with those members, and those members will then deliberate on that subject matter of that committee and come back with recommendations to the commission. So that process itself could be a few months from now. So we're not talking about now. It may extend beyond the legislative session by the time the committees legitimately, obviously, deliberate on those subjects. So I think time-wise, it'll be a while before all this creation of the committees and the deliberation of the committees and the committees coming back to the commission further deliberating and narrowing down the recommendations in agreement or disagreement with the recommendation of the committees.
Chair?
Yes.
Can I address Commissioner Flo Khan's comment?
Yes.
It's my understanding too, subcommittee work would be optional. I don't know, are you required as a commissioner to serve on a subcommittee? That I'm not clear on.
No.
I also, right. So I guess that could address some of those issues. Back to, Dr. Barron's comment as well too. I suppose if you're a subcommittee member of one topic area and not a member of another, you could still participate if, say, you saw the agenda and you said, wow, that's a very interesting presenter. So I suppose there could be some flexibility in terms of what work you can and are willing to do. I also, one comment that I did not make is I also saw the subcommittee work, while it rolls up to the commission, also maybe producing a final product that we could present to the governor in terms of recommendations that are much more fleshed out, that could be really based on the subcommittee work. So I wanted to kind of add that in after hearing what has been comments made already.
All right, appreciate that. Next, Commissioner Sarah.
I believe that concludes all commissioners. If I've missed
right.
anyone, please speak up, but I think that it concludes all of the commissioners' comments.
So to narrow the subject down and to move forward, perhaps we need to take a consensus vote or otherwise as to the number one, the creation of committees, and then number two, what title of committees. So if that is okay with the commissioners, we can at least first take a vote if we have to see who all are in support of creating subcommittees, number one. And then the question of subjects, there is some overlaps from Mason and Commissioner Yelney on these. There's an overlap. So if that is okay, we can take a vote and get it out of the way to move forward. Is that okay with everybody?
Chair Khan?
Yes.
Sorry, this is not agendized for action today. There was not enough information to really agendize it in a way that would give the public the ability to participate in the formation of the subcommittees. So the way this is agendized today is to get as much information as possible about the subcommittees, what subcommittees might be possible, and then agendize it in a way so that at the next meeting it can come forward. You can form those subcommittees, populate them with members, and allow the public to weigh in and say, you know, this subcommittee is important, and I think that just allow the public to participate in the actual formation and population of those subcommittees.
So Greg, my question to that is basically at the next meeting, what you're suggesting is that it'll be an agenda item again to take a vote to create committees, and then also what committees, titles, and then we'll have to give commissioners time before the meeting after that to submit their names and interests in which committees they want to serve, so that they have time to digest which committees, unless the commissioners are already ready with their thoughts on which committees they want to serve and announce it at that time to do that. Is that what you're suggesting?
So what I was suggesting is that you can continue the conversation today. There was a lot of overlap, at least from what I heard, about what sort of committees would be of interest to the commissioners. Workforce development, cost and accessibility, affordability and access were things that I heard you sort of mentioned in multiple ways. So I think if those are the wills of the commissioners, without a vote, even Sarah could put together a commission item or an agenda item for the next meeting that says possible formation of these 3 different subcommittees, describing the subcommittees in a little bit of detail. Sarah, if you think you have enough detail to put that agenda item together based on what is the conversation so far, and then at the next meeting, there'd be an up or down vote on each of those subcommittees, and you could also populate those subcommittees with members at that time.
Good. So I think for the members' consumption, perhaps then members should be ready in their own mind with their decision to serve on any one of those committees, potentially that there is an overlap, as Greg has alluded to. If that's okay, then maybe we can wrap it up at that time, a vote on the committee, subcommittees, and then based on the subcommittees, people can express their interest at that time and populate it. Correct, Greg?
Yes, that would be acceptable. I think I generated some questions from some of your commissioners, so.
Right.
apologies for
I
that.
think I see Bobette.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Khan. So what I would like to do then is, can we wait until today's presentation is over? Because today's presentation might generate ideas about what the committee structure might be. We might need a subcommittee from this meeting today. And because my concern would be if the next agenda only has these 3 committees we've talked about, but other committees become important, then we're stuck inside another meeting waiting for the committee revisions to come out. So how could we structure it so that there can be a discussion and vote on committees without locking ourselves into these 3 specific committees that have been named right now?
Greg, you have comment?
So certainly you could delay the vote on this item until after the presentation. I think that was what Commissioner Bond was suggesting. So you could table this. You've had some robust discussion here. You could table this vote until the end of the meeting, which I think would satisfy her concerns. That's certainly permissible.
And then we could
Okay.
add a committee if we need to. I'm sorry, that would be great.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the understanding.
I feel
So if
better
yes,
about
Essentially, you
that.
hit the pause button on this agenda item now, and if that later agenda item caused a new idea, certainly you could you could continue the discussion.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. If there are no other comments, we'd like to move on. We are running a little behind on item number C and 5 is discussion of workforce development, nursing force issues. So I think if the commissioners are okay, if we are going to create a subcommittee on this subject, which is an overlap from at least 2 commissioners, then perhaps this would be covered under the subcommittee development if that's what we choose, and can be discussed at length by the subcommittee to come back with their recommendations to the whole commission, if that's the way we all go. Would that be acceptable so that we can move on to the next agenda item, since this could be wrapped up under a subcommittee if that subcommittee is created?
Mr. Chair, this is Commissioner Van Houweling. I agree with your thought process there. Unless there's any new additional information that we haven't seen in the past in front of this commission, I think that would be the appropriate place to dive into that.
Perfect. Any other comments?
Mr. Chair, may I comment?
Please,
This is
please.
Darlene for the record. So I agree, since I am not going to bring any new information about the subject. I just wanted to bring up the attention about the workforce issues that we started speaking about at our first meeting. And also last year, we saw a presentation from Dr. Packham. I wanted to bring it up again so we can use it as a subcommittee and maybe dive into a little more in detail. So
Perfect.
I agree.
Perfect. Thanks. I think I see. Howard, you have a hand raised? No? Okay. All right. If no other comments from anybody else, then I think we can move on to the Executive Director's Report, item number 6. Sarah?
Okay, are we ready to move on? Sorry, I was just wondering.
Yes, we are ready
you
to
need
move on.
Okay. So commissioners, I'm going to just open up to give you a quick update on our pending legislation. I don't have any new updates to give you outside of what I've been sending in our weekly updates, but for the public and everybody watching, just so you know that the Commission's 2 pending legislation, Senate Bill 5, Senate Bill 40, has been introduced and assigned to Senate Health and Human Services. They both received their first hearing last week. No action was taken, and as some of the public commenters mentioned during their testimony this morning on Senate Bill 5, most notably there was no opposition on the record for that, but there were several amendments presented, and those amendments for both bills are being worked through the legislature. My next expectation is for Chair Ratty of the committee to make a decision as to when she feels comfortable hosting a work session on both pending legislations, and then it'll work its way through the legislature through the next steps.
So on that subject, Sarah, I think it has, at least from my point of view, it's been very, very helpful to me, at least, your regular weekly update on the legislative process that has been a point of contention for some commissioners, and perhaps rightly so. There was lack of communication, perhaps in their own mind, and perhaps factually true. But that has been a big plus. At least everybody's up to date, what's happening, what's not happening. So that's been really helpful, Sarah, and thank you for that regular update. I would like to hear from other commissioners what they think about the update. Is that enough? They would like to hear more of whatever it is from Sarah, or less of, or they're being overwhelmed by it. But I'd rather be overwhelmed than people having complaints that they are underwhelmed and not hearing anything. So any comments from the commissioners? If not, so.
Chair Khan, this is Tony Sloan.
Yes, Tony.
I just also want to offer my thanks and appreciation to Executive Director Sarah, because I think that the weekly update is just awesome. It really does help to provide one place you can go. And if you actually save them over time, you can keep up in a way that's meaningful. The fact that it's not, that it comes and you can read it on Sunday afternoon, or you can read it in the moment there, is very, very helpful in keeping up. And I know what it takes to write one of those things and continue your communication. And I want to let you know I'm very appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And
thank you, Tony. Go ahead.
And this is Commissioner Khan, and I would just echo that. I think it's very helpful. It keeps us up to date as to what's happening. There's a lot of moving parts to all of these proposals, and I just think, Sarah putting it all together for all of us and sharing that information has been very informative, and I just want to express my appreciation as well.
Yes, Babette.
Thanks, Dr. Khan. I agree. I think it's a really good way to keep up. So thank you for doing it. It was a good addition to what we get. But I also wanted to just express appreciation for the presentations you made. I listened to the hearings on SB 5 and SB 40, and your representation of the commission and the way that you walked through the bills and the way that you talked about the dialogue, I thought was really accurate and really helpful, and you did a great job.
thank you.
Just a reminder to the commissioners that we have discussed in the last meeting, if any commissioner in his or her individual capacity is interested in giving their comments, opinions, etc., on these bills as they are debated, they have the right to do so. But commission as a whole has already done its job and wrapped up their recommendations. But
Thank you, Chair Khan. It looks like you're frozen. Dr. Barron, may I lean in on you to manage this meeting?
Sure. As such, I think, Tony, do you have your hand raised? I see in your box your hand is raised. I'll call on you.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Barron. And it actually, one of my comments goes back to what Commissioner Khan was talking about. I just want to make sure I'm clear. I think this is what he said, but it's actually very helpful that he brought that up. Given that we are all stakeholders in multiple different groups, it's okay that we testify at these Senate hearings as long as we disclose that we are a member of the PPC. Is that accurate? And that we are not testifying on behalf of the PPC.
That's correct. And that is exactly what the legislative guidance was aimed at disclosing, was making sure so that fun legislative guidance provided by the Attorney General's office is one that I intend to keep sending whenever there's like a bill hearing, just as a reminder that yes, when I say I encourage you to testify, if that is something that you're interested in, you definitely should. If that's how you want to participate, there are multiple ways to participate. Testifying during public comment is certainly one of those options for each of you. You just need to be mindful that when you go and represent, you're representing yourself as an individual and not as the commission.
Got it. One other question Interim Chair Barron, if I might. We heard in public comment today, 4 stakeholder groups that came together as it relates to SB 40. Will we be able to distribute their thoughts on the proposed legislation for commissioners to understand the perspective and see? I'm trying to figure out process here a little bit.
I think Sarah did distribute in one of the emails links to all of the proposed amendments to our 2 bills, and solicited us for comments back to her on if we had any on those amendments. I think I sent her 1 or 2 comments myself, and certainly, Sarah, you could certainly send out that email again if you were so inclined. I'm interested in I don't know if it's the DAG that we have to ask this question, but it sounded like some of the interest groups that Dr. Slonim was referencing, who spoke this morning in public comment, were interested somehow in the PPC discussing their amendments, and I didn't know if that was really agendized, or if that's really the process that we do, or is that left to others to discuss, and left to the legislative committees and Senator Ratty, for example, and things like that. So maybe process could be addressed with us.
Sure, I can take, I think there's a couple of components to both of your comments, a little bit of an overlap, but yes, indeed, what I do is I try to inform the commission as quickly as I'm informed on any proposed amendments, anything that's related to some of the action for each pending legislation. So one of my emails prior to the bill hearing was to just send you all a link of everything that had been submitted to Nellis. The best source of information is to go on to the Nevada legislature website yourself and follow along on your own. I do my best to keep you informed, but I may not be able to inform you as quickly as everything is being posted. And when I send it out to you, it's a courtesy for you all to be informed. And then should you feel inclined to provide feedback to me, I welcome that so that I can share it with any legislators who reach out to me to ask about the pending legislation, to Chair Ratty. I am the voice of the commission in the eyes of the legislature. And so naturally, legislators are going to ask me about questions related to the legislation. So as much as I know from you individually, I'd be happy to share that information to either the chair or any legislator who asks. In particular, when it comes to proposed amendments, what I did in the case of Dr. Barron and others is that if you do have some feedback, yes, I'd like to know about it and I'd like to share it with the legislatures, but I'd like to take it another step further and see if I can connect you with the sponsor of that proposed amendment and then help facilitate a discussion between you two to maybe address your concern. So Dr. Barron had a concern about one of the proposed amendments, and I asked him if I could put him in contact with the sponsor of that amendment, and I did. And they started communicating, and so I just really am helping to serve as a kind of a connecting point. When it comes to a discussion about the pending legislation, if you want to have a discussion about the public comments that were made, I think that's allowable, Greg, under this topic item, but I'm not sure that there's anything actionable. But if you want to say something about it, I think that is certainly permissible, but I would, and that's a separate thing because that's a meeting or open meeting law compliance. So I would defer to Greg on that because I don't want to say yes and then him tell me no.
So generally with regard to legislative amendments and bills, if a commission wants to consider whether to take a position, that normally requires sort of a specific actionable item to say, this is what we're going to consider and this is what we want to take a position on. So a little bit more of a heightened level of agenda notice, so to make sure the public is aware of what's going to be discussed. I don't know if that fully answered the question, Sarah.
I think so, but then I'll go back to Chair Khan's earlier statements, and I think he's back on about just emphasizing that the commission has concluded their discussion on these pending legislation in his eyes, and that it's moved over to the legislature. And I believe that is the stance that this commission has taken thus far. So it would be kind of a change and going back, and I would defer to our chair on how we want to move forward or make it a priority or reprioritize. Of course, it's at the pleasure of the commission and our chair.
This is Commissioner Van Houweling, and thank you, Sarah, for everything. All the updates are very helpful. Just looking at our two bills, SB 5, there's you get support, neutral, opposed, but not a whole lot of amendment activity there compared to the SB 40. And I know you've been tracking and following that very closely for us. Could you go? I guess ultimately, and currently with SB 40, there's no opposition, which is great. It's just a matter of tweaking. But what are processes? Who accepts those amendments, and how much flexibility does the commission have in accepting those? And would you mind quickly going through those amendments on that SB 40 in particular? Because I think that's going to be far more discussed than SB 5 at this point.
I can but I can tell you that if I do a walkthrough now, I would prefer to kind of go back to our bill hearings. They were quite long. I think they were like 2 or 3 hours. And so a walkthrough would be quite lengthy. I'm certainly happy to, but I really want to be mindful of everybody's time. And I know we've got other presenters on the agenda. So I don't know. I'm going to defer to Chair Khan if that's okay with the timing. I don't mind doing that, Commissioner Van Houweling.
I'm okay, Sarah. I guess the bigger question I think that we're all asking is who's the voice for the commission to be able to tolerate some of these amendments or accept them to be able to get it across the finish line. So I have good summaries here, but
sure. So the decision is in the hands of the legislature. So the commissions, even in your proposed bill draft request, that's exactly what it is. It's a request to submit pending legislation for the legislature to consider. And ultimately, it's going to be in the hands of the legislature to decide how that bill moves along during their process. Normal course of legislation goes through many iterations and many discussions, but ultimately it's going to be in the hands of those who are dealing with that each piece of legislation at that time. Currently, Senator Ratty, it's in her committee. So the place in which both legislations are being decided and discussed for movement is in the hands of the chair of Senate Health and Human Services. And so then when it moves over, it's going to move over to hopefully both of the pieces of legislation continue to move, and it'll go over to floor session. It'll go over to floor, and then it's in the hands of every single senator. So you've got 21 senators, and then they get to decide what they want, and they'll have opportunities to do amendments on the floor, discussion, and it's just really the normal course, but the decision will be in the hands of the legislature at every single step. It'll just change who may be the point person. Hopefully that's clear. Like right now, I'm working with Senator Ratty just to answer any questions that she has, but I respect that they are both in her committee, and it's at her discretion to decide how they move along. And then it'll go over to the Senate, and then it'll repeat itself back over to the Assembly, and then it might go back to the Senate and repeat the process.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sure.
You're on it.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we are at 10 a.m. We have presenters here. Unless there's a compelling question, we could move on. Is there a compelling question in somebody's mind on? If we don't hear any, then I think we could move to our next agenda item.
Or I will try to be.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm a little bit ahead of myself. I will try to be very quick. I just have a second agenda item, Chair, and that is just to do a quick update on the Peterson-Milbank program, which will hopefully launch into the presentation by Baylor Health on the next agenda item. So I will try to be very quick, but commissioners, I just want to remind you that as you're aware, our state was interested in pursuing participation in the Peterson-Milbank program for sustainable healthcare costs as an effort to address healthcare cost growth. Once we were invited, I was asked to serve as the designated state official to lead the program's work across our governor's administration, which led to our state's approval. We joined Connecticut, Oregon, New Jersey, and Washington in this multi-state collaborative. And I just want to take a quick moment to say, you know, healthcare costs have risen dramatically in the US over the past several decades. Healthcare spending in the US rose nearly $1 trillion between 2009 and 2019. National health spending is projected to grow at an average annual rate of 5.4% to reach $6.2 trillion by 2028. The high cost of healthcare is harming our business growth, squeezing families, and our state budget. Our governor remains committed to addressing the rising costs of healthcare and increasing access to help individuals and families across the state, especially in our ongoing battle with the pandemic. In Nevada, more than 50% of the racially diverse population is at risk of poor health outcomes. So it is important to look at the best spending options our state's healthcare dollars to ensure adequate funding is funneled to communities that have been disproportionately affected by racism and oppression. He also believes that it is important to monitor healthcare cost growth trends as the delivery of routine healthcare services begin to ramp up. Our governor is seeking the assistance of this commission to join me in our state's participation in this program. And specifically, he seeks your recommendations to, 1, develop a statewide healthcare cost growth benchmark, 2, calculate and analyze statewide healthcare cost growth, and 3, analyze drivers of healthcare cost growth. Your recommendations are continued to be needed on how we can build, strengthen, and sustain the healthcare system and public health infrastructure our state needs in these unprecedented times. Those comments I took piece by some of the statements that our governor made in our letter to the commission last week. And so it may sound repetitive to you, but for all of the public that is watching, I will direct you to our website in which you can go ahead and view Governor Sisolak's letter to our commission. So Chair Khan, that concludes my remarks on that update. And I believe the next agenda item launches into a presentation from Baylor Health, but I will pause there and answer any questions. And I hope that was brief enough.
So, thank you, Sarah. I think we should move ahead with the presentation, and I would request the commissioners if they could please make note of their questions, so that at the end of the presentations, we'll try to take everybody's questions. The presenters that I talked to before via telephone have assured me that the 2-hour presentation includes enough very generous time for questions and answers. So let's proceed with them. Are they online?
They are. Mr. Baylett?
Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to be with you today and look forward to working with you on your cost growth benchmark work. I'm going to share a presentation. Sarah, you want to say something?
I do. I'm so sorry. I would be remiss if I did not just also pause for a moment and introduce the commission to Ms. Rachel Block, who is the program manager for Milbank, who joins us today. And she will be with us on this journey. And so I just wanted to formally introduce the commission to Ms. Rachel Block as well. And then Baylor Health is providing the technical assistance for our state. And Mr. Baylett, I think you can handle the introduction on your end. So.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
So my name is Michael Baylett, and our firm Baylett Health will be providing assistance to you on this journey. We are assisting the 4 other states that Sarah identified as well, and also previously assisted the states of Rhode Island and Delaware in the design and implementation, and now in the ongoing support for their cost growth benchmark programs. And so today you're just meeting me, but you will meet my other colleagues in future meetings. My hope today is to give you an introduction to cost growth benchmarks so that you have an understanding of the concept, the logic model or the rationale behind cost growth benchmarks as a tool to improve healthcare affordability within a state. And then I'm going to share a lot of information with you about the work being done in the other states and how their approaches and designs are both similar and differ. And you will have plenty of opportunities to ask me questions as I proceed. All of the topics that we will be discussing today, or that I'll be introducing today, we're going to come back to for the purpose of designing a cost growth benchmark strategy that works for you. So today is really just to explain what others have done without limiting you in any way to those prior examples. So I want to start by asking three basic grounding questions. What is a cost growth benchmark? Why would a state want to pursue one? And what do we know about its impact on healthcare cost growth? Then I'll give you an extended presentation of what other states have done. I want to speak specifically about cost growth benchmarks in a time of a pandemic. And then I'd like to share with you a proposal for how the commission might conduct its work over the coming months to design a cost growth benchmark program. So first, what is one and why would any state want to pursue it? So in simple terms, a healthcare cost growth benchmark is a per capita target for annual healthcare cost growth within a state. It's intended to be as broadly inclusive of all healthcare spending as possible. Why pursue one? It's pretty simple. Healthcare spending growth has eclipsed wage growth and state economic growth in just about every state in just about every year, I would say for the entirety of my career. And so you've got data here for 2018, 2019. This was a period of particularly high GDP growth. Obviously, we've not had this the past year during the pandemic. But usually per capita healthcare spending within the United States has far exceeded wage growth and has exceeded economic growth. In recent years, economic growth within states has moved faster than average or median wage growth. And you can see that difference here. So this is the problem that we are trying to address through a cost growth benchmark strategy. I want to note that you will sometimes hear me use the word benchmark and sometimes use the word target. That's because some states use one term and some use the other. I would view them as synonyms. Your language, at least as of right now, is for benchmark, so I'll use that term with you. But if I speak about Oregon and Rhode Island, I may sometimes refer to their cost growth target instead of a benchmark. So these are all of the states that are involved in this work right now. The green states have cost growth targets that have been set and are being implemented, and I'll talk about what implemented means later on. The states in blue are committed to development, and in the case of all but Pennsylvania are actively working on the design right now, and California is having active conversations. So you can see this work has sort of started on the coast so far, which I think is often true on a lot of health policy strategies, and then they move towards the middle. Why did the states pursue this strategy? All for the same reason, all because of problems with the affordability of healthcare. And the states, when they communicated this publicly, put it in different terms, and you can see the different terminology that, or the different framing that they used. But it was all about healthcare being too expensive or growing at too fast a pace. And that was the imperative for pursuing this strategy. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on what I'm referring to as the logic model. And I'd like to invite any questions and comments you have on this, because I think it's essential. So setting a public target for healthcare spending growth alone is unlikely to slow spending growth. But the cost growth target can be a really powerful anchor that sets an expectation for what spending should be within the state on a year-over-year growth rate. And it also creates the basis for transparency, and through transparency, some accountability for all of the actors within the state to make good faith, and I would say even better, effective efforts to achieve the benchmark. In fact, I had a fascinating conversation with someone in another state recently, and he said to me, you know, when we established our cost growth target, I was thinking this wasn't really going to be all this impactful. But now that we are publicly reporting out results, I'm realizing that this has great potential for serving as an impetus for us to take important, impactful steps to slow cost growth within our state. And that's really how I would view the benchmark. It's an anchor to which you can attach lots of other complementary efforts that will help slow healthcare spending growth over time and make it more affordable for consumers, employers, and taxpayers. So to make the model effective, there need to be complementary strategies. So what might those be? So I think there are four. I'm going to start in the top left with transparency. Transparency means public reporting of performance against the cost growth benchmark in a way that is responsible, but names names, and specifically identifies how different actors who play an important role in healthcare delivery and influence healthcare spending have performed relative to the benchmark. So transparency is a first really important complementary strategy. I'm actually going to go in counterclockwise order. So I'm going to go next to cost driver analysis. And what this refers to is data analysis to understand where our costs or where spending, I'm using them interchangeably, I just want to know, but we're really talking about spending. Where is spending highest, and separately, where is spending growing fastest? And those won't always be in the same areas. But without understanding patterns of spending and without understanding patterns of spending growth, it's hard to take action to slow spending growth. And so cost driver analysis, which looks at both where spending greatest and where is it growing the fastest, and I'll note also perhaps how it also varies across the state, is really essential for the identification of opportunities. And those opportunities should then lead to taking action to make the cost growth benchmark successful. Now, in all of the states that have preceded you, there is an operating all payer claims database. As you've just been discussing, you don't have one quite yet. You've recommended legislation to create one, but you don't have one yet. So that means that your cost driver analysis is going to have to, in the short term at least, make use of different resources than what the other states are doing. And we will talk about this at great length another time. But I just want to highlight for the logic model how this all works together. So first, there's the cost growth benchmark, which is the anchor. There's transparency to bring attention to performance. There's data analysis to identify where are opportunities to slow cost growth. And then in the bottom right corner, there are policy initiatives. This is a broad term, but what it really means is action to address the cost drivers. And those actions might be taken at multiple levels. Can include state policy action. It can include public and private payer action. And it can include delivery system action. Finally, it can include purchaser action. And of course, collective action by multiple parties. Without the policy initiatives, then this model doesn't really work. It's really necessary to link the measurement to taking action to address cost growth drivers. So what might those actions be? I'll give you a couple of examples just to make this a little bit less abstract. And they're from two states that have moved earlier than you have. One is from Rhode Island. So Rhode Island established their cost growth, they call it target, in 2019. And they have analyzed their all payer claims database And a recent analysis looked at spending between 2015 and 2018 and found that in the commercial market, retail pharmacy spend accounted for 53% of spending growth over that 4-year time period. And I want to note that's before pharmacy rebates, so it'd be a little bit less than that, but it was the largest contributor to spending growth. And so in Rhode Island, they have been spending a lot of time with their equivalent to your commission, reviewing strategies specifically targeting pharmacy prices. In Oregon, their parallel body to this commission has prioritized as a first initiative expanding the adoption of value-based payment methodologies, including budget-based methods that would align with their cost growth. They call it Target 2. So those are just 2 examples of different approaches that are being taken, and that's really what we mean by policy initiatives. The initiatives that you would follow would emerge from your own group process and your own analysis of data. And then finally, the 4th element of the logic model is one that's sometimes employed by states, but not in all states. And this is creating some more formal accountability for performance than just what transparency provides. And I think transparency provides a lot, but there are some states that have required more. So 2 states, Massachusetts and Oregon, require that payers, specifically health insurers, and large provider organizations that exceed the cost growth benchmark be required to develop and implement a performance improvement plan if the exceeding of the benchmark isn't for a reason that seems justified. Oregon's language is actually in a bill that's before their legislature right now, but all signs are that that bill is likely to pass. The bill also goes even further than just the performance improvement plan, and it says that an entity that after the performance improvement plan continues to exceed their cost growth benchmark, again for unjustified reasons, would be subject to a financial penalty. They are the only state to do that. All of the other states have no accountability mechanisms beyond transparency. But I wanted to note those for you. All right, so let me pause now and invite any questions and comments you have on the logic model before I go on to tell you about what do we know about the effectiveness of cost growth benchmarks.
So Sarah, you want to manage the questions as the people raise their hands?
Yes, so I put in a chat just to have everybody raise their hand, and then I will call on each one. So Dr. Barron?
Thank you, Sarah. Michael, a question I had was, in the other states that have implemented the logic plan, with their various all payer claims databases, et cetera, how has it worked, given that a substantial portion of Nevada's insured, for example, do not necessarily fall under the auspices of state policy initiatives and state legislation. So Medicare, Medicaid, self-funded plans account for altogether about 75% of our insured, leaving the other 25%, some of which are uninsured. 11% are still uninsured in our state. What portion of the population in some of these other states actually gets affected by the state initiatives, given that there's so much opportunity to opt out, or also being federally managed as opposed to being managed at the state level? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So I think there were really 2 questions that I pulled out of there. One is the self-funded, and the other is Medicare and Medicaid. What about them? So as I'll describe a little later, measurement of performance against the cost growth benchmark is done on an all-payer basis, and for the commercial market, that includes the self-insured. The way that measurement is done is that states make a request or require that licensed health insurers within the state report aggregated performance information, that is spending data, for their full population, both the insured and the self-insured. And so the self-insured are included, and the policy initiatives that are pursued, it depends what they are, but they certainly can impact the self-funded employers. But of course, it depends what the strategy is. I would say that in terms of the public payers, that the strategies certainly are inclusive of Medicaid. They're a little less focused on Medicare because states have far less influence on the Medicare program. But I would certainly say that Medicaid is included in the umbrella of policy initiatives that states might identify.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Or do you have a follow-up?
Nope.
Next, any next question?
Yep. Babette?
Well, thank you. And thank you, Michael. This is very helpful. I can't wait to dig into each of these categories. I think it's great work for the coalition, this commission. But I wonder if there's so two things. I was going to talk about ERISA too, so I'm glad that you raised that. I think the commercial payers having both their commercial accounts fully insured and their self-insured ERISA numbers in here is really important. And I think that picks up a big chunk of Nevada that these conversations keep missing. And I'm glad for that clarification. So thank you. My other point I wanted to make though, is there a way for you to go into detail, maybe you have it in this deck, of which states are doing what, because you're talking about it and it's helpful, but it'd be great to have a chart. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to do that next. I'm going to go through state by state and give you an overview of what they're doing.
Okay, and in the breach of not having our all payer claims database up yet, it would be great to know if you have suggestions about other documents that other data we could use to sort of fill the role of what an all payer claims database would do until we have one up. That would be helpful too. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, and Babette, I'll answer that. What I'm thinking is that initially what the state has easiest access in terms of data resources is the state employee health plan and Medicaid. It's possible that there may also be a commercial insurer or two that would be willing to help fill the information void in the period before your all-payer claims database is operational.
Great.
And I'll note that New Jersey's in the same position. They also do not have one. And so it's possible that we'll get some cross-state learning on how best to do this absent an APCD.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have Commissioner Sean Shaner.
Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. You had mentioned potential corrective action plans for an insurer if they exceeded the cost growth benchmark. So just using Dr. Slonim or Mason as an example, who run hospitals, if they came to an insurer and said, I need a 50% rate increase, and that was ultimately agreed to, would an insurer be placed on a corrective action plan because they would have exceeded the cost growth benchmark? Or would that explanation of Dr. Slonim and Mason asking for 50% increases and getting it be sufficient for not being placed on a corrective action?
So let me know, only 2 states have these performance improvement plans. None of the other states do. So I just want to be clear on that. And I'm not recommending that you do it. I'm just trying to let you know that there are 2 states that do it. But I would say in that instance, if there was a 50% rate increase and it caused both the insurer and the 2 provider organizations to exceed the benchmark, that would probably be viewed as unjustified unless there was some really amazing reason why a 50% rate increase was necessary.
Okay. And for the record, I'm just picking on Dr. Sloan.
Yeah.
I know they would never do that. So
we know where to find you.
All right, why don't I move on, if that's okay?
I have, there's 3 other commissioners, actually 1 pulled back. There's 2 other commissioners that if we could call on them and just have them try to be quick, if we can. Commissioner Flocon?
Thank you, Sarah. Quick question, just in terms of going back to the cost driver analysis in the all payer claims database. For the other states that you mentioned, did they all have all payer claims databases in place? And then how long did they have them established prior to policy initiatives being drafted?
So they all had what I'll call mature claims databases, and that they'd been around for a while, except for Delaware. And Delaware still doesn't have one, to the best of my understanding. But the rest of them did. I will also say, though, that they had not used them in the fashion envisioned here. They've been used in other ways. In many cases, they actually were underused. So this application of their all payer claims database required some data cleaning because there were some problems that had gone undetected previously because it had never been tested quite as much as this requires.
Dr. Slonim?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks again for the presentation. Great. Just two quick questions. One, how, again, you may have mentioned this, how is the cost growth benchmark set? Is it a compilation of data, right? You got to figure out where you start and level set before you can go forward and identify cost growth efforts. So how is that initial one set?
So that's the magic that you all are going to work as a commission.
Okay.
I'll share what other states have done, and part of my job will be to facilitate your conversation to set the benchmark. But it's a group process. I will say, as I'll share shortly, most states have looked to applying external economic indicators and linked their benchmark to those indicators, but which ones they've used and how they've used them has varied, as you will see.
The second one is a better understanding using the logic model about how to get to that answer of the cost growth benchmark. We take into account, and maybe this was what's coming, you know, we currently rank 49th in the nation as a state in terms of quality. We are traditionally in the bottom 5 states nationwide for healthcare access, prevention, healthy lives, disparities in care, et cetera, et cetera. And that's with being a Medicaid expansion state. So the heterogeneity in the state, I don't want to make any excuses for it. We have an obligation to make sure we're doing that. But at the same time, you wonder about how do you make up decades of failed investment that have to be brought into this as you're setting those benchmarks is something I'm very interested in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
and that's that.
We know that in particular areas like our physician reimbursement in Clark County is really low, for example. We know that in order to maintain a network of access to providers in the rural environment, a place that's already challenged with access issues, particularly around certain subsets, it's going to get even worse. And that's all pre-COVID. So I'm just wondering how we go about a step. That first step seems really important to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this provides a framework for you to make explicit decisions about if you're going to exceed your cost growth benchmark, for what purpose are you going to do it for, and what's justified and what's not justified.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So actually, I'm going to go back. Let me give a little context. So the first state to implement this strategy was Massachusetts. They passed legislation in 2012. And because of that, they're the only state that's been doing this long enough that we have any sense of what its impact has been. Because the next 2 states were Delaware and Rhode Island, and they are only literally right now reporting out performance for the first year, which was 2019. So I'm going to share with you information from Massachusetts. So they established it in 2012. Spending in Massachusetts has averaged over all these years their cost growth benchmark level, and has been below the US average in terms of growth. Being below the US average for Massachusetts is remarkable because Massachusetts was above the US average every year prior to this for many years. Their benchmark for the first 5 years was 3.6%. It dropped in the 6th year to 3.1%, and that's where it is right now. You can see in their second and third year, they had a couple of spikes. One of those was related to the introduction of the drug Sovaldi, and that was viewed as a justifiable reason to exceed the cost growth benchmark. But overall, they have brought down their per capita spending to levels that compare favorably, again, to the US average for growth and to their cost growth benchmark. This graph shows what was annual spending growth in Massachusetts prior to their benchmark and then after. It only runs through 2018. So what impact has it had? So one thing that's clear is it's created a common goal and a common target that's known to everyone. Two, there was a fair amount of total cost of care contracting. That's what TCOC stands for in the state. This is ACO model contracting, where a payer and a provider set a per capita or per person budget for a year for caring for a population. And the benchmark was consistent with that contracting approach. And because of that, negotiations between payers and providers were influenced by the benchmark. And in fact, the payers and providers began their negotiations annually, and that continues through to today, using the benchmark as a reference point. And the impact of that was to temper price growth, because it's been price that has been causing healthcare spending in the United States to grow over the last several years, more so than it has been utilization of services. And finally, transparency has kept this policy and performance in the public eye. I will note that Massachusetts has been very active in enhancing the transparency of their work. They have public hearings every year to review performance against their cost growth benchmark. They have testimony by providers and payers. This is not some obscure policy that nobody pays attention to. Here's some quotes from members of their Health Policy Commission, which is, for our purposes, a parallel commission to yours. These are a few years old from when the target was still at 3.6%. But the commissioners and then the state auditor study, I think, reinforced the point that I made, that that contract negotiations between payers and providers have been around the cost growth benchmark. All right, so now I want to walk you through all of the states one by one. Sarah, I'm hearing some feedback. I don't know if that's me or if it's somebody else who needs to be muted. Okay, so 5 states have established cost growth benchmarks to date. You see them listed here. For each of them, I'm going to review how do they establish their benchmark, what are their values and what's the methodology, how do they assess performance against the benchmark, and what accountability and any enforcement mechanisms might they have. And feel free to jump in with questions as I do this. So I'm going to present them in chronological order, so that's why Massachusetts is first. Massachusetts began its cost growth benchmark program after it did coverage expansion. You might recall that Massachusetts expanded coverage before the ACA. And so within the state, there was this feeling, okay, we've addressed coverage, now we have to pay attention to cost. So Chapter 224 in 2012 established healthcare cost growth benchmarks. It established 2 entities, a Health Policy Commission to set and enforce the benchmarks, and then the Center for Health Information and Analysis to collect and measure performance against the benchmark. These 2 investments are beyond what most states have. mean, the Center for Health Information Analysis just analyzes and reports on healthcare spending data and other market characteristics. So they are really set up for in-depth analysis and public reporting in a way that a lot of states are not. The benchmarks in Massachusetts are set in statute, and they are tied to something called the potential gross state product. This is a forecast of average growth of a state's economy for years 5 through 10 into the future. So for the first 5 years, the benchmark was set at potential gross state product, or PGSP, which then was 3.6%. That's much higher than any state would have right now. Then the statute said it should be PGSP minus 0.5%. And then after 10 years, it reverts to PGSP or whatever the Health Policy Commission sets it at. When they measure spending, they're measuring what they call total healthcare expenditures for Massachusetts residents from public and private sources. So this is only for spending associated with people who live in the state. There are two components: total medical expense, which is spending on all medical services. Essentially, it's payments by payers to providers, be they for claims or non-claims-based payments. And they are inclusive of patient cost sharing. So deductibles, co-insurance, co-payments, all included. Then separately, there's a calculation of what's called the net cost of private health insurance, or in lay terms, it's insured administrative expenses and profit margin. And this is only applied for commercial insurance, Medicaid managed care, and Medicare Advantage, not for traditional Medicare or for Medicaid fee-for-service. All of this together is total healthcare expenditures. That's what they're measuring every year. And I will say also, this is what every other state is measuring every year, although there are some smaller payers who are included in some other states. The total healthcare expenditures does not include any spending that's not part of covered services. So for commercial insurers, it wouldn't include dental care, but for Medicaid, it does include Medicare. I'm sorry, for Medicaid, it does include dental care. It also, because it's only expenditures that are made by payers to providers, it doesn't include any provider costs associated with caring for uninsured residents. The way that measurement is performed is commercial insurers submit their total medical expense at a summary level. Again, it's the allowed amount, which includes the patient cost sharing, fully insured and self-insured, all managed care products for Medicare and Medicaid. For expenditures that are not complete, this is especially true for value-based contract arrangements that might have quality incentives or shared savings payments that will be made in a subsequent year. The payer is to estimate a completion factor. So they're supposed to estimate what they think those payments would be. And then for payers that have carved out services, so frequently pharmacy isn't included by self-insured employers in their TPA arrangement with a commercial insurer, then the Center for Health Information and Analysis makes an actuarial adjustment. They also collect information from other payers aside from insurers. So the state Medicaid program has a primary care case management program. So fee-for-service data from the Medicaid agencies collected. Medicare Part A and B and standalone Part D is collected from CMS. And they have some other sources of health spending, including Veterans Health Administration expenditures. Annually, they report at 4 levels. The state for 3 insurance markets, commercial, Medicare, and Medicaid, by payer, so Medicare and Medicaid, but also by individually by insurer, and by provider entity. Now for insurers and for providers, there's a volume threshold so that you're not reporting on everyone. You're not reporting on a primary care practice with 2 physicians, for example. There have to be a sufficient number of members or for provider entities attributed lives in order for there to be public reporting. Now, as you remember, Massachusetts is one of the 2 states that has some accountability mechanisms. So the Health Policy Commission can require providers that exceed the benchmark to implement a performance improvement plan, and they can levy penalties for non-compliance with the plan. The Health Policy Commission has conducted reviews of provider entities that exceed benchmarks, and they've met with them, but they've never required a performance improvement plan. And I think that speaks to the impact that their very public process has had. Simply stated, payers and providers don't want to be called out for exceeding the benchmark. Any Massachusetts questions? I mean, I want to make sure we get through everything, and I think we have enough time, but if you do have any questions about Massachusetts, especially because that was the first state and they have the most experience, I want to give you the opportunity to ask any questions.
We have one question from Justin.
The thing I wanted to ask about is we had the chart on how they're meeting the benchmark with the average over the years. Mm-hmm. Do we have something that shows what data they actually pulled to look at what the major drivers were, either the highest cost or the fastest growing, and when the policy implementations went into effect that we can tie directly to this reduction? Just ruling out the possibility that it's not directly correlated to the policy, but just an averaging over time of ups and downs.
Well, I mean, there is some averaging of ups and downs, but their ups and downs have been lower than what they were before they implemented the policy. I guess that's all we know. A little bit surprisingly to me, there has not been a rigorous evaluation of the Massachusetts program by independent researchers. I'm surprised by that. I think there should have been by now. So all we have is the descriptive information that I shared, Justin. Okay. But I want to answer your very first question. You asked about is there analysis of what's driving spending? And yes, there's exhaustive analysis. So both the Center for Health Information and Analysis and the Health Policy Commission publish reports on a regular basis that drill down into what's driving healthcare spending. They also look at trends separately for each of the markets, and they look at other trends, for example, out-of-pocket spending. And I will say that one area where Massachusetts does not look successful is in consumer out-of-pocket spending. It has grown far above their benchmark. And the reason for that is probably obvious to all of you, but I'll just be explicit about it. The way that employers have dealt with high healthcare benefit expenses has been to buy down coverage. That means to expand coinsurance and deductibles so that premiums are lower. And that means that consumers are assuming more and more out-of-pocket expenditures, and what was once rich insurance is no longer rich insurance in terms of coverage. I'll also say that individual consumers are doing some of the same. When they are faced with choices and the premiums are so high, they will oftentimes select a health insurance product that has a very high deductible as a means of reducing their premium. So I don't think anyone in Massachusetts thinks that they've achieved a healthcare affordability nirvana yet. But I do think there's a belief that they are a little bit better off than they would have been if they not implemented the policy. I also want to note, if you want to go to the websites for either the Health Policy Commission or to CHIA, the Center for Health Information and Analysis, they've got all sorts of meeting materials and recordings of the Health Policy Commission's meetings available to you. I know you've all got busy lives, but I just want you to know they're very public about everything that they do, including live broadcasting of their meetings the way that you do yours.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. There's no other questions.
So I have one quick question. you're talking about Massachusetts and a couple of other states you are in, specifically to the provider compensation reimbursement issues, specifically when I say providers, not just the hospitals, but the provider physicians, whether it be primary care or specialty care. And that obviously is different in different states, the reimbursement situation for the providers. In your experience, have you noticed shrinking provider networks because of reimbursement issues to the physicians specifically, or not?
No. And I would say what's happening with provider reimbursement is less about fees being reduced, but it's about those providers that traditionally have had a lot of market leverage and could dictate what their rate increases were. Those rate increases have been a little bit more modest because of the strategy. I think that's been the biggest impact on compensation.
So, Dr. Barron, you have any comments since you are in the trenches?
Well, no, I mean, I think you made the comment earlier, Ike, that I mean, every state's gonna have their own individual issues. One of the big issues in our state is provider reimbursement and starting out at kind of a lower level compared to other places, a lot of other places, and when you're starting at a lower level and providers think that their compensation is already at a lower level, when you implement cost controls, the providership might feel like there's an unfair disadvantage already in trying to control that because you're starting out at a lower level. So I don't know if there's some plane setting. I think that there's some opportunities, as Michael kind of inferred, in terms of the ACO models, and some he didn't call it this, but pay for performance types of initiatives that could be beneficial in terms of provider reimbursement rates that we're not seeing necessarily as widespread now in Nevada. But I think that your point earlier, Ike, was well taken, is that we're starting out at a lower level. We have to sort of be cognizant about that when we implement some of these changes.
Right, thanks. Any other questions? We can move on otherwise.
Yeah, we have a question from Commissioner Bond.
Okay.
Thanks. I wanted to just make sure, since this is the third comment about physician reimbursement in this presentation, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of discussion about this going forward. And I've unfortunately got a hard stop today, so I hope we get through all this. But the counter of that is, even though we're almost last, as Dr. Sloanim's talking about with quality, we're not last with facility or hospital reimbursement, and we're quite high. So I think there's going to be two conversations here. What's going on with private equity? What's going on with for-profit facilities and hospitals versus, the primary care physicians? They're in different worlds, and I'm hoping that this helps identify all that and account for all that.
Yeah, and this is why the data use strategy is so important. So Connecticut just finished an analysis of their APCD and looked at commercial spending. And what they found was that professional spending per year was growing on a per unit basis at less than 2%, but hospital spending was growing per discharge and per outpatient service and per ED visit at 7%. So you can only get at those nuances, and they are state specific, by doing detailed analysis of data that tells you what's going on within your state. And it is a state specific story. Okay, let me tell you about Delaware. Delaware was the second state to establish their program. Their legislature in 2017 directed the state to plan for implementation of a healthcare benchmark, and then the governor issued an executive order a year later to formally establish them. They have two bodies that oversee their program: the Delaware Healthcare Commission and their Economic and Financial Advisory Council. Their benchmark was set at 3%, but they added transitional adjustments. So the first year they were at 3.8%, which is the highest any state's done. But by next year, they're going to be at 3.0, and will be there for 2 years. They have a committee that each year reviews PGSP. So they're using the same future economic forecast for their state, but theirs is 3%. You might remember Massachusetts in 2012 was 3.6%. Theirs was 3% when they established it. So this committee annually looks at the components that go into calculating PGSP, and they decide whether there were any material changes to them so that the target should change. Thus far, they have not changed their target or their benchmark. Okay. Oh, one thing I didn't mention, but because you were talking about quality, you'll note that the name of their program is Healthcare Spending and Quality Benchmarks Program. So unlike Massachusetts, Delaware established quality benchmarks at the same time that they established healthcare spending benchmarks. And that was explicitly to give equal weight and elevated priority to both quality and to spending. Again, other states have not routinely done that, but Delaware did do it. And their quality benchmarks are a mix of what I'll call public population health measures, as well as healthcare quality measures. Okay, Rhode Island is focused on healthcare spending, and so that's why their program is called the Cost Growth Target Program. So they actually began before Delaware in 2016 when the governor brought together a group of healthcare leaders, and she said, please recommend to me a methodology for setting a cost growth target for Rhode Island. And they did so, but then the state was unable to secure funding to support the work. And so they had a long delay until they obtained foundation funding by actually the Peterson Foundation, which is supporting your work as well. And then in August of 2018, they restarted their work. They convened a steering committee with 18 stakeholders representing diverse perspectives to develop recommendations. And they did so in super speedy fashion, meeting twice a month. And by December, they had established their cost growth target. What's also interesting is that initially it became effective through a voluntary compact signed by members of the steering committee at their own initiative. And then 2 months later, the governor established an executive order further establishing the compact. So it exists both under the compact and under executive order. The state administers the program and has ongoing policy advice provided by the same steering committee. They set their target for a 4-year period at a flat 3.2%. Next year, they will be reevaluating it. They were the third state to use PGSP, and they are the last example I'm going to share with you of a state using just PGSP. I think it's fair to say that Delaware and Rhode Island largely copied what Massachusetts was doing in terms of the methodology for establishing the benchmark. Rhode Island has a little bit of a escape hatch for their 3.2%. They agreed that if there were highly significant changes in the economy, then they might revisit the 3.2%. And wouldn't you know, but we had a highly significant change in our economy last year. Interestingly, they decided that despite that, they did not want to change their cost growth benchmark. And so they kept the 3.2%. They have coupled their target with a data use strategy that leverages their all payer claims database, or APCD. And in their case, they've used health services researchers at Brown University to perform analyses to help them identify where opportunities lie. I gave you the pharmacy example before. They've been looking at physician specialty spending as of late to identify opportunities that might exist there. Both Delaware and Rhode Island use total healthcare expenditures, as does Massachusetts. Also, as does Massachusetts, insurers submit data every year. They both publish at the 4 levels that I talked about for Massachusetts. There are some details where they vary, and we will talk about those when we work on your design elements. Okay, so Oregon and Connecticut represent sort of a second group of states to follow Massachusetts.
Michael,
These
can we
two
pause
states-
for just 1 second? I'm sorry, I got Flo who wanted to, Commissioner Khan, I'm sorry, would like to ask you a quick question.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. Again, you mentioned the pharmacy growth in Rhode Island, but in the Brown report, but just for my understanding and clarification, with that Brown report, you did mention that that did not include rebates and discounts provided by the drug manufacturers. And that, as we have seen in other states, can be significant in terms of identifying, and it's important to have an identification of real cost growth within a particular area. So just want to put that on the record that, it is important, as you mentioned, data is really important, but really having all of the information around that data becomes significant when you're evaluating real cost drivers.
Yep. Yeah. So let me explain a little nuance in terms of analysis. I completely agree, Flo. So when states do analysis of their spending, they do it 2 different ways. One is using their APCD. They also analyze the aggregate data that the payers submit. So when the payers submit their data, they don't just provide a total medical expense calculation, but they also report it by service category. And so they'll break out inpatient hospital, outpatient hospital, long-term care, pharmacy, and they also report rebate data. So the all payer claims database doesn't have rebates, but the data that come in from the payers do. And so in all of these states, they're able to track what retail pharmacy spending growth has been net of rebates. You just can't do so out of APCD. And I guess that's all I'll say there, but thank you for that clarifying comment, Flo. Okay, so Oregon and Connecticut were the next 2 states. Their cost growth benchmarks just became effective in January of this year. Connecticut acted based on legislation passed in 2019. The Oregon Health Authority was the lead agency working with their Department of Consumer and Business Services, which is where insurance regulation resides, and their Health Policy Board, which is sort of a board to the Health Authority. They too created a body like your commission. I will note that in most of these other states, they created bodies just for their cost growth benchmark. That's obviously not your situation where you already existed, but in a bunch of these actually in all the other states, the body that was created specifically for their benchmark program. So unlike the other states, they didn't link it just to PGSP. They considered multiple variables. They decided to weight historical gross state product growth rather than projected. They also use historical median wage growth. So that's when you're using wages, you're using a little bit more of a consumer-centric view. And they already had healthcare spending caps for their Medicaid program as part of an 1115 waiver with CMS. And their legislature had applied that same cap to their public employee benefit programs. And that existing cap was 3.4%. So they started for their first 5 years at 3.4%. And then for the next 5 years, they dropped to 3.0. So this was the first state to deviate from just using potential gross state product and to use multiple variables. They will, in 2024, consider what the values should be for 2026 to 2030, essentially to reaffirm the 3.0%. So unlike all the other states, they are assessing performance using total healthcare expenditures, but unlike the other states, they're including Indian Health Service spending, and they're including health expenditures in state correctional facilities. They also differ from the earlier states in that they developed a mechanism of statistical significance testing to determine whether their cost growth target had been met by insurers and by large provider entities. They are to report at the same 4 levels that all the other states are. And as I talked about, they are taking accountability one step beyond any other state. They've got a bill before their legislature that has what they call an escalating accountability mechanism. And it applies to payers or providers who exceed their target without a reasonable basis for doing so. And it's the Oregon Health Authority that will determine whether it was reasonable or not. They've identified some criteria that might be used, but not limited themselves to them. So initially there's a performance improvement plan. And then after that, if you don't meet a target in 3 out of 5 years, then an organization is subject to a financial penalty. In addition, they can assign fines for late or incomplete data or late or incomplete performance improvement plans. And they can apply accountability measures earlier if payers or providers are just not engaging in the program. This is all part of the bill before the legislature right now. But again, one likely to pass from what I understand. Okay, and last, state of Connecticut.
Before you go on, can I ask a question, please?
Please.
As it relates to, help me if you will, I think you highlighted really well some of the issues at the lower performance levels. What about, how do these states manage where there's variability in performance? Imagine that there are really high performing zones of the ecosystem in healthcare that are actually performing really well from a cost perspective. Over time, the law of diminishing returns would suggest they will be disenfranchised because it's harder for them. They still have to keep taking out costs when it's, they've already done those investments early on. How do those other states manage that point? For example, we know in the ACO world, the Accountable Care Organization world, right? If you take the average Medicare spend per beneficiary and the average is $9,500, $10,000 a year, if you're performing at $8,500 a year, you're already 1,500% better than the average, but you'll be disenfranchised because it's harder to get to those next level cuts.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit different than ACO programs where you're looking for generating savings year over year, and after a while, there are not the same opportunities as there are for those, as you said, have really high spending. I think the cost growth benchmark or target is viewed as being a desirable rate for sustained spending growth. Now, it is true that it might be easier for organizations that have a lot of excess spending to get to it than other organizations, but I think they view it as something that every organization should reasonably be expected to do year over year. But it is critical to note that this target, be it 3% or 3.5%, is applied to organizations whose spending is high and whose spending is low. The same for all of them. I haven't heard a lot of complaining about that. In fact, I've heard no complaining about that in other states. There are low-cost providers in other states who've said, hey, we need to start publicizing the variability in spending by provider so that it's clear that there is a lot of variability. But that's mostly because the low-cost ones want to show everyone else that they're way lower than everyone else. It's not really in opposition to being held to the same benchmark as everyone else.
Got it. And I really appreciate that last presentation because it seemed as though included the cost and the quality conversation as one part of it. What have other states done as it relates to assuring that there are thresholds for quality and access, so that, you know, one way to cost savings could be reduction of programming?
Right.
That would be overall bad for the community, even though it would save money. How are they preserving, assuring, and I'm particularly worried about Nevada in that context, where we've got so much ground to make up on the access and quality side?
Yeah, so two ways. So, you know, one is by setting, as Delaware did, setting quality benchmarks. And actually Connecticut is the other state. Connecticut is in the process of developing quality benchmarks to become effective 1/1/22. But there's another way, because as you know, there is a risk that organizations could say, well, the way that we're going to hit the benchmark is by limiting access to needed services. Now, I want to note, there's no evidence that that's happened in Massachusetts since 2012. But is there a risk of it? Sure, there is. And so consumer advocates in Connecticut were concerned about this. And so before Connecticut's benchmark became effective this past January 1st, Connecticut developed a set of measures for assessing unanticipated adverse consequences from their benchmark. And they're going to measure on a pre-post basis what's going on multiple levels, focused on access to services, to see if they can detect anything, in addition to having their quality benchmarks. So that's what the others have done so far.
Very good, thank you.
Yep. Sarah, any other questions or comments?
No.
Okay.
No.
So Connecticut began with an executive order, not with legislation. The governor of the state, a little over a year ago, directed the Office of Health Strategy to develop cost growth benchmark, quality benchmarks, and primary care spend targets. So the primary care spend target is a target to get the percentage of total spending on healthcare that goes to primary care to 10% by 2025. And so this is viewed as a complementary strategy. There are a few other states that have primary care spend targets. Oregon is one, Rhode Island is one, and then there are some other states that measure primary care spend, but they don't have a target per se. So in order to do this work, the Office of Health Strategy convened what they call a technical team, but it's a stakeholder body that includes state agencies. So it looks like this commission in some ways. They separately created a stakeholder advisory board. So this is a much larger group and a more representative group. And that body provides input to the technical team. I'll note Washington is doing the exact same thing. They have a healthcare cost transparency board that's developing their benchmark, but then they separately have, in their case, 2 advisory committees that are providing input to the board, one specifically for providers and payers, and another one focused on data-related issues.
So I think if in interest of time, there is some commissioners have to leave. If we can continue the presentation and hold the questions till the end, as I had suggested in the beginning, that would be helpful. So maybe we can proceed with the presentation and hold our questions on the subjects that are compelling to us towards the end. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So Connecticut, they also didn't use PGSP or plain PGSP. They used a 20/80 weighted blend of forecasted PGSP, that's 20%, and forecasted median income. Median income, 80%, is because they had a real focus on consumer affordability, because as I shared earlier, state economies have been growing faster than wages have. And so that's how they came up with this 20/80 blend. It led to a cost growth benchmark of 2.9%. Like Delaware, they're doing a staged implementation. So it's starting a little higher for the first 2 years. And then for the last 3 years, it's at 2.9. And like Rhode Island, they have an escape hatch. It's not for significant changes to the economy. It's just for a sharp rise in inflation. couple of differences from some other states. They, like Oregon, are including the Veterans Health Administration. Like Oregon, they're also including state correctional facility healthcare spending. And like Oregon, they're also going to apply statistical testing to determine if payers or providers met the benchmark. And in fact, they're using Oregon's methodology. So some of the states are in dialogue with one another, and that's some of the work that we do. We a little bit play a Johnny Appleseed role, sharing ideas across the states, and we'll certainly do that for you. They're going to report at the 4 levels of the other states. There are no consequences for not meeting the benchmark. There are no financial penalties. There's also no performance improvement plan. Just transparency. That's the only consequence. Okay, so a little bit about cost growth benchmarks during COVID-19. So we know that COVID-19 has had a lot of impact on service utilization and spending. Provider revenue fell in 2020 compared to 2019. We know that there was a dramatic drop in services in the spring, and that had mostly recovered by the fall. And we also know that the spending drops were most dramatic for ambulatory care settings. We don't really know yet about what impact the fall and early winter surge had on spending and utilization. So what does this mean for having a benchmark? Well, the reason for having a benchmark is to, is to establish a consistent expectation for spending growth. With the understanding that events might cause time-limited fluctuations. I don't think anyone anticipated a pandemic, but there was recognition that individual events like the introduction of the drug Sovaldi might cause spending to go up or down. So generally the perspective of other states has been that providers and plans should not be penalized for the impacts of COVID-19. So we know that if spending was depressed in 2021, that healthcare spending growth in if spending was depressed in 2020, that spending growth for 2021 is probably going to be high and probably is going to be above benchmarks. And so states recognize that, and they've said, hey, we're not going to penalize for the impact of COVID-19, but we want to keep our benchmarks in place to have consistent expectations about spending growth for the long term, because we're not doing benchmarks as a 1 or 2 or 3 year strategy. This is a long-term strategy to which we're committing. So all 3 of the first states kept their benchmarks in place, and Connecticut and Oregon did not modify theirs for COVID-19. So, in your work, you'll need to consider when you set benchmarks for 2022 and beyond, whether you want to address the impact of the pandemic on spending growth calculation for 2022. And this is something that we can talk about over the coming months. Any questions or comments on COVID-19 and healthcare benchmarks? No?
No.
Okay. So last part of my presentation, and then we'll open up for discussion. I want to share with you a proposed meeting timeline and process. This is how we will get to your having consensus on a cost growth benchmark methodology, including the value and data use strategy and an approach towards developing policy initiatives to address cost growth. So the whole logic model as I presented it earlier. Our goal is for you to finish this process in time so that you can establish the benchmark value prior to 2022 and have it in place then. The approach that I want to suggest to you is that you create a subcommittee, and I know you just had a long conversation about subcommittees before I joined you, but that you create a stakeholder advisory committee to give you reactions and suggestions as you do your work. As I noted, this is something that Connecticut did and something that Washington is about to do. And the idea would be that the body would allow additional voices beyond just those on the commission to come together in a facilitated meeting at which there would be a presentation of whatever you had discussed at your last meeting, and they would hear what your preliminary recommendations were, and they would be invited to provide any feedback and recommendations to you, which would then be shared with you at your next meeting. So you would essentially be in dialogue with the advisory subcommittee, although never actually meeting with them. So that's an idea I want to give you for a suggestion. So this timeline assumes that you would have such a body. So your next meeting is April 21st. And at that time, I propose that we talk about some principles and operating procedures for benchmark strategy development. You as a commission don't currently have operating procedures or bylaws for how you do your work, but you will need to make a number of recommendations as we develop this benchmark strategy. And so my recommendation is that you have some operating guidelines to govern how you do so, that you could also apply, frankly, for your other work. And we would then start working with you at the next meeting, working through a series of what I refer to as design decisions. So I would present to you a design question. I would share with you options, pros and cons of those options, and share with you what have other states done, and then ask you what you want to recommend. And so you can see here for the second bullet and the three sub bullets, these are the topics that we would talk about at our next meeting. And then if you do want to have an advisory subcommittee, it would meet between your April meeting and your May meeting. And we would give them an introduction to cost growth benchmarks and talk about their role vis-a-vis your role. Then in May, we would talk through additional design decisions on the cost growth benchmark methodology, including economic indicators to be used to inform the benchmark value, and even some possible benchmark values. And then in a meeting between your May meeting and June meeting, we would go back to the advisory subcommittee and we would say, here's what the commission's thinking about in terms of the cost growth benchmark methodology. What do you think? And at the June meeting, we would bring you their feedback and you could decide whether you want to accept it or not accept it or a mix of both. We would then move on to talking about performance assessment. So who gets measured and how they get measured, and some technical issues about how do we identify which patients belong to which provider organizations. You go back to the advisory committee again, and this would become routine. Then in July, we'll talk further about performance assessment, and we would talk a little bit about authority and governance related to the benchmark program. Then again, go back to the advisory subcommittee. In August, we would talk about transparency and accountability, and we would introduce the data use strategy, and then share all of that with the advisory committee. In September, we would talk about cost growth mitigation strategies to make sure the benchmark strategy is successful. And this would just be an initial conversation. Frankly, you'll be talking about cost growth mitigation strategies long after this calendar year, but this would be an initial conversation. And we'd catch up on anything else that we might be behind on, and then take that to the advisory committee. In October, we would give you a first draft of your recommendations, and we talk about what the process should be for benchmarks for 2022 and beyond, and also talk about how to implement all this operationally. And go back to the advisory committee, subcommittee one last time, and then in November, bring you a revised set of recommendations and ask you to approve them for implementation of the benchmark in January of next year.
Michael, can I step in for just one moment? Because I think what's really important is looking at all of these topics. It seems like it covers a lot, and indeed it does. But just to manage the commission's expectations, can you just go over the timing of each presentation at the commission meetings? I know that we've discussed about maintaining the 2-hour window. Is that reasonable for each one of these meetings?
So it should be, but I can't say for certain. I will say that in other states, we generally schedule meetings like this for 2 hours, but it depends what your group process is like. In Oregon, they had to extend the meetings because they just had a lot of discussion and debate. So I think 2 hours is a reasonable assumption for right now. But if you have some really great discussions and we need more time, then that's a possibility.
Great.
So
Thank
this
you.
is Dr. Khan. This is Dr. Khan. My concern in all this is we like to have a hard stop for 3 hours. Everybody on this commission is voluntarily on, and they have multiple engagements and commitments. To have them sit here for longer periods of time is a challenge. If we have 2 hours of presentation by a group each time, that leaves us just 1 hour for other subjects and issues of concern by the commissioners. Like, for example, today we had 1 hour to run by other subjects and try to wrap it up in 1 hour. So it may be a little challenge to have this every meeting 2 hours, where we are left only with 1 hour to try and look at other issues, which some of them are quite compelling for some commissioners, if not all. And everybody needs to be, entertained on their areas of concern. So we have to figure that out somehow to manage the time so that we don't get overwhelmed by this one subject, which is very, very important, obviously. But at the same time, it shouldn't be at the cost of some of our other agenda items that are evolving as we speak.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
maybe we could figure out who has appetite to extend these meetings, though. I mean, you can't do it without notice. I think if we wanted these meetings to be productive and we need this much time, maybe members would be okay with longer meetings. I could do it if we schedule in advance. I don't know how others feel, but I mean, that seems easier than not getting the work done. But I just wanted to throw out, I'm usually one of our toughest schedulers, and I would do that if we plan it.
All right. Yeah, I think we need to get a sense from every commissioner, see where they are all. I mean, to extend these. I remember we had one 5-hour meeting, and I said, God help us all, we are done with this meeting. So I certainly personally would want nothing to do with a 5-hour session every month, because it becomes exhaustive and people lose interest after 3 hours or so anyway, and it becomes a challenge. Besides everybody's schedules also. So I think it's good to poll the members for sure, but certainly not get overwhelmed by the timing.
Sarah, I have a question.
Sure. Can we? Dr. Slonim had his hands up, and then we'll go to you, Flo.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dr. Slonim.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Chair Khan, thank you for the opportunity. I'm wondering, is it possible, Michael, that we can get this presentation? That would be really helpful. Second, I hear, Chair Khan, your concerns. I think that this is important work. The thing I'm concerned about, in addition to this, acknowledging that this is important work, it seems as though this can be all-consuming for the commission. And I, for one, am a little bit interested and at the same time worried about how this became the one thing that we're going to do in priority to everything else that we've considered over the course of the last year. It seems like we've gone down a track where we haven't necessarily, as a commission, we said, okay, let's go do this. But this sounds like a really big piece of work at the exclusion of a whole bunch of other stuff. And I just want to make sure that's clear for the record, and a better understanding a little bit about how we're going to balance multiple priorities without getting sunk on this one alone.
Yeah, Yeah, and that's my concern also, as I just voiced. Any other commissioners in line for a question, Sarah?
Yes, Flo. Commissioner Khan.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And I guess I agree with Commissioner Sloan. But my other question really to the chair and to Sarah is, what is our role as a PPC with respect to this benchmarking process? I understand the Peterson-Milburn, that we're to play a part in this, but what is our specific role in the development of this benchmarking framework?
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner Khan, for that question. So I'll remind the body that the Commission's authority is limited, and it, by and large, is an advisory group, right? You have all been chosen by the governor to represent our healthcare industry in our state, and he looks to you for those recommendations. And so your role in this process is to advise our state, particularly advise our governor on your best recommendations. And during the course of your discussions, I think we will share different options for an implementation strategy in which you would present your best, recommendations for the governor to consider. And so there isn't any statutory authority in actually implementing this. This is all advisory in nature. The commission is unique in the sense that you do have the ability to request legislation for the next legislative session. And so if you want to keep that in mind as something that's in addition or separate, but still all advisory in nature.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bohannon.
I feel the same as everybody else. I guess I'm a little confused how we landed here. It doesn't seem very clear to me. I actually thought for some reason that this was going to be housed through DHHS. That could be my confusion, but I guess I do think that there should be some defining before we jump into any of this work. We should talk about how this is going to work, because Nevada has completely unique challenges compared to all the states that were mentioned. I see us having just so many different issues. And so figuring out who and where this is, like, who has the authority, and, seeing how a lot of these came through executive orders from the governor and having legislative bodies appoint them. I am kind of curious how this is going to look in Nevada and making sure that it is successful, because I think everything that was outlined would be very important for our state, but also making sure that we're not taking the entire role on ourselves.
So this is Dr. Khan. So, and I think I'm on the same page with a lot of the thought processes. How do we balance this whole situation? One of the main reasons we are looking at all this is the direction from the governor to look at this program and see where we come on to that in terms of recommendation. So that's where the direction has come from. And I think you should have received the governor's letter to the commission in that context. So having said that, the big challenges we have all alluded to is how to balance our time where we don't just get carried away with one item and where several other items are already in our evolving agenda, as I've said earlier. So I think that's the discussion we need to have. And I think today may not be the best time, but I think perhaps at the next meeting, everybody should be able to chime in as to their thoughts on priorities and time allocations, so that we are the ones who determine what should be our time allocations and how do we proceed in this whole scenario. One thought comes to mind is a lot of this presentation that is coming in live, like today, perhaps then can be shared with the commissioners earlier on, ahead of time. We can digest a lot of that information and perhaps have the questions ready for the presenters at the meetings, so that they'll save time of having a full live presentation. That way we have thought through our questions in our free time and come up with the questions more rather than an hour worth of presentation. That'll save us time. We could allocate an hour for questions, all prepared, and spend the rest of the time on other subjects. if that makes sense to everybody.
I appreciate that, Chair Khan. And just a reminder to the body that this presentation had been shared with the commission formally on Friday as a part of the meeting materials. The roadmap and the preliminary benchmark 101 presentation was sent to you all a couple weeks ago. So you have had several weeks to review these materials, but it would be very helpful in the future to have feedback prior to the meeting so we could facilitate our time efficiently with questions.
So my point is that we don't have to necessarily go through the full live presentation if it has already been shared with everybody like this time, and people have questions, and we focus on the questions and answers rather than a presentation all over, which everybody would have received ahead of time. And I would hear from other commissioners if they think this is a good idea for time management.
Yeah, I have Commissioner Bond with her hand raised.
Thank you. I feel like I want to say a couple things. I think that it's great for us to have time to ask questions, but I honestly think this is going to be a working board on this issue. I think what was presented today, and I think what was contained in the governor's statement is sort of, it's kind of a call to have the PPC do this work at the governor's request, and it's the governor's board. So I think what we should do is figure out how to create time to get the work done. And again, that may be longer meetings or separate meetings or more work done in an advisory group, but I don't feel like it's a burden. I feel like we're actually kind of being honored that we're in a position to do this. And it is a perfect fit for what was the Patient Protection Commission was created for. If you go back to the governor's initial presentation to us the first day, it was all about these issues. So I appreciate that we're being included and that we get to lead on this.
So next in line for question.
I have Commissioner Roa Dugan.
Yes, thank you. I also agree with Bobette. So I think that based on the governor's letter, we are being tasked on heading this project and acting as an advisory board to create these benchmarks. I think we should divide our time between this project and the other commissioners' priorities. This should be one of the priorities as it's been tasked by the governor. My suggestion would be maybe to increase the meeting to 4 hours. It's just 1 extra hour. That way we can do 2 hours of the benchmarks and then 2 hours of other priorities.
Any other suggestions, thoughts of commissioners? This is the time to speak up.
Yeah, Dr. Khan, this is Howard Barron. I agree with what Yarlani just proposed. I'd be willing to sacrifice a 4th hour if I knew in advance monthly that that's what we were going to do, so that we could share equal time with the work of the commission alongside this special project.
Okay, any other thoughts before we go to the next item on the agenda of meeting schedule?
Dr. Sana?
Yes.
Thank you, guys. Just one question, going back to what Attorney General Ott said earlier in the meeting. So what we're doing right now is conversation, I guess, for this agenda item. And then if we decide to have subgroup meetings, that'll be formalized for the next agenda so we can make a decision on it. Is that? And then I guess the other question is, where will the other subgroup conversation go in the context of this agenda now that we've heard the presentation?
So for clarity, I think we are still on Michael Baillett's presentation on the agenda item. I think if we want to conclude his questions and your feedback on that presentation, I think we can then move over to the next agenda item and then continue on with the discussion from earlier in this meeting. Is that accurate, Attorney Ott?
Yeah, that is totally fine. I don't think either of these are action items. So, but to make sure the record's clear, I think it's good to close this one out and move back to the other one whenever you're done.
Yeah, so that's actually my point. So this is simply a presentation. There's no action here.
Right.
Right?
Right.
There's no action for subcommittee. There's no action for agenda at this moment in time. We are just listening to a presentation.
Correct. That's the attorney's advice that for something to be an agenda item for action, there has to be advance notice so that the public can comment on that. Is that correct, Greg?
Correct. And these were agendized for information for the committee. And whenever this presentation is done, you can talk about the subcommittees and probably have some agenda items for the next time around.
So if I may suggest, based on your recommendation or suggestions, Greg, is that for the next meeting, we can put it as a possible agenda action item for the other committees that we were talking about, for the creation and non-creation of those committees, and maybe put this on the agenda item as a potential for at least the one I think was whether to create or not to create a stakeholders committee for further input. And the action item is to whether to go forward with this program and project formally, correct? Greg, we haven't formally said that we are going to endorse and proceed with this program as a commission.
Dr. Khan? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Roth. I just don't understand how we don't. Are you suggesting we have the option to not endorse this program?
No, I'm saying is apparently we have to have an action item on the agenda for public notice ahead of time before we take the actual action to do that. That's my understanding, correct? Is that correct, Greg?
So I don't want to get you bogged down too much in procedural issues. I mean, the application has been submitted and Nevada has been welcomed into this wonderful program. So I don't think the commission needs to formally ratify that. But if the commission is going to form some subcommittees to get some additional recommendations or how it's going to divide up that work, I think is something that may require action at a meeting. Does that?
Okay, all right. Unless somebody else has another question.
Well, Chair Khan, I think that's the conversation, kind of next steps. But what I'm hearing is how do you operationalize this and who's ultimately responsible? And Mr. Whitley's on the phone as well. And I think that's again, I'm supportive of continuing the conversation, but the way it's agendized, it's not to take action, it's more informational. But my big concern is what I've heard from everybody is how do we operationalize and what's our authority and who's the keeper of providing a high-level report back to this commission.
If I can, I know this is kind of a blended discussion between Michael Bailett's presentation and our next agenda item. But one of the things that I wanted to put in front of this commission is a consideration of a separate meeting between now and your next meeting to talk about operating procedures. Michael Bailett alluded to it earlier that this commission lacks bylaws. We don't have them. What we operate on is our statutory authority. But in order to do this work and have a discussion in kind of an organized way, there is a framework and outline that other states have utilized to adopt operating procedures. And so what I would like to propose is sharing a template that Bailett Health will help facilitate for circulation for this commission to consider, and then potentially considering a special meeting between now and the next monthly meeting for you all to just have a discussion on the operating procedures and adopting something that suits everybody's concerns.
So my concern on that would be, I think it's a great idea. However, to have another special meeting in between in terms of notice and for other people to adjust their schedules, that I think Dr. Barron has rightly also pointed out, on short notice to readjust and change your schedules sometimes becomes a challenge. If there's a monthly meeting, everybody's put aside that time, which is great. So whether it's possible on the 21st of April, allocate some time up front for the operational part after everybody has reviewed their template and already prepared their recommendations, suggestions, deletions, alterations to that, so that we can deliberate and get it out of the way at our next meeting in the morning. And if everybody is okay, since they've put away 3 hours, if they can put an additional hour so that we get this major item out of the way, so we have some direction on how to operate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Chair, do you want to, it looks like we got Commissioner Bond and Commissioner Barron with questions, but should we just keep it to the presentation item right now for Baylor and then close this out and move into the discussion about the agendas?
I would think so. There were a couple of questions. If they're related, we should entertain them.
Okay.
I just want to make sure we have time. Thank you, Dr. Khan. I just want to make sure we have time to do this work. So if you're suggesting that we extend the next meeting to 4 hours to do it, or as Sarah's suggesting, we have an additional meeting between to do this work, we need to decide which of those we're going to do. And I would like to hear from the attorney about what authority we have today to do that, because I think we need to do one of those.
Greg?
So you don't need to take action to adjust your schedule or to take longer meeting times. You can certainly have a discussion under future agenda items and say, look, we've got all this work to do. Now we may need to think about longer items, but it doesn't need to be a formal action. You can sort of come to a general consensus or not. And then the chair, the committee meets at the call of the chair. And he can schedule those as appropriate and for the time appropriate, consistent with the conversation.
So Dr. Barron, I thought Dr. Barron had the question, right, Howard?
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with what Bobette just said. I mean, certainly, I think you heard a few people say it's okay to extend to a 4-hour meeting for next month. If we can accomplish the presentations and work of this project in 2 of those 4 hours, that would be great. I harken back to what Michael said in his presentation, which is that most other states did not have a PPC type of commission set up prior to receiving this grant and so forth and being entered into this project, and they had to create one from scratch. I also recall him distinctly saying that sometimes stakeholders that weren't necessarily on the appointed commission could potentially be asked to participate if their expertise was necessary. And I know we talked about this a year ago about whether it would be worthwhile for us to avail ourselves of some of our colleagues that are not necessarily on the commission or voting members of the commission or even ex officio members of the commission to help us expand and do some of this work on this special project. And so I guess my proposal is that I would agendize a 4-hour meeting for next month. I would not propose to have a meeting in between. And I would propose that we do plan to have, as Michael suggested, the meetings in between of a subgroup that's made up of us. And if we deem appropriate as a commission next meeting, that we could bring in, a few other individuals if necessary to help populate that subgroup that is going to work hard on this project. Those are my thoughts.
All right. Any other thoughts before we wrap up and go to the meeting schedule?
Commissioner Bohannon, do you have a question on this presentation?
I do actually. Because of time, I'm curious if we can maybe connect with Michael offline, because I actually did not ask any questions just for time, and I had plenty of questions and feedback. So I'm just curious if we can actually.
I see Mike nodding, so that means he's okay. And Sarah, you can kindly connect them offline so they can do that. So if I hear everybody correctly, or heard some of you, some didn't speak, that perhaps to extend for 4 hours the next meeting and incorporate that, since everybody has scheduled that meeting on their schedule, and try to manage the operational part of it and have time for this, as long as we get the advanced templates of what was going to be presented and we have our questions ready in time of efficiency. Does that make sense? At least for the next meeting. Then we can see how it turns out. If it is getting to be prolonged further, we can revisit it. But I think the operational agreement or operational draft paper is important, so that gives us some direction and guidelines, so we are more structured in what we are doing or not doing. So I think that would be very helpful for us also, just as much as the significance of this particular subject at the request of the governor.
Dr. Khan, I would just like to ask Sarah if that's realistic. She's the one that helped put together the timeline. And if we need another meeting, if we're already going to be behind, I would just like us to consider an additional meeting now instead of lose a month. but I would defer to the people that understand the scope of work better.
I really appreciate that perspective. So again, I'm mindful of everybody's time. I just do see the value in this body considering a special meeting, even if it's just for an hour or two, to talk about the operating procedures, and then also talking about what was brought up is the discussion about an advisory subcommittee. It sounds like there might be some appetite from this commission to consider that option, and if so, it does make sense. I think logistics-wise for you to kind of separate the discussion so that each monthly meeting is really focused on the substantive discussions around this program, and then having a special meeting first to kind of establish groundwork on your operating procedures and potential advisory subcommittee. Now, I'll remind this body that if you do want to consider an advisory subcommittee, you have a couple different options. You could think about an advisory subcommittee that's already in existence in our state, and I could reach out to some other bodies that may already be interested in the commission's work, and then may want to take on some additional work themselves and be helpful. Or the commission could consider recognizing their own advisory group in the form of a subcommittee, because we do have a ability to appoint, or I shouldn't say appoint, Greg, but you could have members that are not on this commission. So this commission has the authority to create subcommittees with other stakeholders. So you all do not need to be on the subcommittees. And so if you want to establish your own advisory subcommittee, I just think that might warrant its own meeting and own discussion, because there will be a process. And my favorite thing is to make sure that we're compliant with open meeting laws. And I know that our attorney will have a lot of suggestions on making sure that we properly notify the public. And especially if you are considering having members outside of this commission, we would need to make sure that the public is properly notified with those names too. So there's a process in place, which I think warrants a separate special meeting between now and next month.
So let me sum it. Did Howard, did you have a question? Okay, so let me try and sum it up. We are at the future meetings thing. So why don't we move on to that, since there's a discussion on whether we should have another meeting or not in between. So we can decide, because it's within 2 weeks. There are restrictions on posting the agenda items, etc., a week or so in advance of the meeting also. So perhaps we need to get some consensus on a date, even though it's a short notice for the 2-week meeting. It'll be in 2 weeks, give or take, before the 21st of April meeting. So perhaps everybody needs to chime in a hurry, keeping our time limits here, to see what would be the best. It'd be usually meeting on a Monday, and it's a Monday, whether 2 weeks from now on a Monday is okay for majority of the folks or not. So can we have some raising of hands if it is okay or not, because there's really not, otherwise we get to 3 weeks from now and then it's too close to the next meeting.
Right, as a reminder, the commission is going to be moving to Wednesday meetings after this meeting.
So you're asking for a meeting on the 29th, Chair? March 29th right now?
So did I hear Sarah say we are moving to Wednesday meeting?
Wednesday meetings, the commission agreed to host monthly meetings starting in April, every Wednesday, third Wednesday of the month.
So I think then we need to look at a Wednesday available from now in 2 weeks.
I think you can consider a couple different dates. I know Commissioner Bond just mentioned the 29th. I would prefer a Friday afternoon, just because of the legislature and the dynamics there and the workload. But I'm indifferent, and we'll make sure I adjust my schedule to meet the commission's needs.
Chair Khan, just a point of order, please.
Go ahead.
We moved quickly from a conversation of a month from now to 2 weeks from now. We're already looking at dates. And what's interesting for me is, okay, so we've got a priority and 100 other priorities. Somehow we've managed to put this one, we couldn't even schedule a special meeting because we had session, we had COVID, couldn't schedule regular meetings. Now all of a sudden we can schedule, and it seems as though we've lost our attention to process. We've moved to dates, of scheduling. And we haven't even gotten to a point where, okay, this is one priority perhaps, and need to understand a little bit about how we're approaching the work.
So to your question, Tony, you have a good point. However, we just discussed at length that this is something that has to be accommodated because the governor wants us to accommodate this subject. It takes time to discuss the subject, obviously. How do we, the reason we are talking about a specific date is, how do we accommodate this particular subject on an ongoing basis in addition to our regular evolving agenda items? So we cannot afford to bypass that either. So the idea was whether we extend the meeting, scheduled meeting to 4 hours, so we have enough time for our own prioritized agenda items in the past, in addition to this particular subject, whereby the template will be distributed to people ahead of time with questions ready, so that it is not as long as it has become. So it'll remain like an agenda item, like all the other agenda items, in the interest of time.
But
So that's the idea.
But we went from, we were talking about 4-hour meetings, and then we went to a date of the 29th. I'm like, we added a meeting. I'm a little bit.
So yeah,
confused
we
about
haven't
how
had
this
a
is-
meeting. What we are saying is, it seemed like the people here were okay, perhaps a separate meeting in 2 weeks. If they're not okay with a separate meeting and still want to do a 4-hour meeting in a month which is scheduled for 21st April and cover the agenda items, that was still an option.
Dr. Slonim, I'm the one that asked if we needed an extra meeting. I asked Sarah if she thought we needed an extra meeting. Maybe you missed that part. And that raised the issue of how would we do a second meeting?
Yeah,
It was a question.
I understand. I think what I'm trying to figure out is we've had any number of priorities come before us before, and there's been any number of reasons where we couldn't make even a normal meeting happen. And now there's this hurry up and rush to execution that is, frankly, got me confused in terms of the fact that there's any process. So I appreciate the stand on the executive director and the urgency to address this issue. But we've been sitting waiting for 3 months with no meetings. And now all of a sudden, I mean, other commissioners, please chime in here. This is, if I'm the only one that's crazy, maybe I need to just be quiet and move on. But
So Tony, in response to your, why don't we do this in the interest of time? Let's poll the commissioners if they would like to extend the next coming meeting on the 21st of April to 4 hours in order to accommodate our priorities in the first couple of hours and the next couple of hours for this agenda item, or even an hour and a half if people just come prepared with their questions. So how many people want to extend the 4-hour meeting on the 21st of April? We can discuss future meetings later on and proceed with that as of right now. Anybody opposed to that may make it simpler.
Dr. Khan, that means as opposed to having a meeting before our next meeting?
Right.
As opposed to that?
Yeah, in lieu of the 2-week meeting, whether we want to extend the 21st meeting to accommodate this particular subject and our other prioritized items. So that's the question. If everybody can poll in lieu of the a special meeting in 2 weeks, we want to extend the meeting for 4 hours on the 21st of April to accommodate Millbank subject as well as the other items which we have in the past prioritized. Anybody opposed to just having a 4-hour meeting on the 21st, which means we can further discuss on the 21st what to do going forward. We'll have more time to think this through.
I think I'm opposed just because I keep hearing from other commission members that we both need more time to work on our priorities that are not this. And the governor and this presentation has made it very clear we need to work on this. So I thought an extra meeting would add time to do both. It's hard to hear that we can not have an extra meeting now because we didn't have an extra meeting in the past. And also hear that we need to work on all our priorities, but we're not going to have an extra meeting to do it.
Okay, any other commissioner opposed to moving to just a 4-hour meeting on the 21st April to accommodate? Anybody else opposed?
Commissioner Khan, or Chair Khan, any opposition to doing this in person at some point too. I just throwing it out there. I think it's just far more productive to have the dialogue face to face. So I'm an advocate for opening up and being in person. So maybe this could be the first one. I know that we've got distant challenges with those friends in the north and the south, but just a suggestion if we could talk about that too.
So any comments?
Yeah, I think that we do need to be mindful about our kind of public capacity and not having the public space immediately available. So I would just need to make sure that I can find a place, a facility outside of kind of our state agencies that would be able to accommodate that in a safe manner, which I would take recommendations from everybody here on that, but I just want to make sure that if we go down the path of an in-person meeting, that I'm able to facilitate the public accommodations too.
So before we go to the in-person meeting, which I think it's a good idea, why don't we do this? If there's no other commissioner other than Commissioner Bobbitt, we can extend the 21st meeting for 4 hours, discuss everything. Number two, at the same time, Sarah can do some homework, whether for the 21st, any government building room is available for in-person meeting on that day. And if it is doable, we'll do it in person. And if she finds out there's no room available or logistics are not possible, at least for the 21st, then we can certainly look at the future meetings in person, but at least we can try for this one so that Sarah can do some homework and get back to us. Does that make sense, Mason, to your question too?
Yes, Chair. And Sarah, if you need any help finding some public space, we can reach out to the city or the county. They've got some pretty good meeting space that's already marked socially distanced. So we can help with that.
Right. So those who can attend in person can attend in person. We'll still have opportunity of people calling in. So it's not an obligation to just for everybody to come in.
And I will just make a comment that I am not sure, because I don't know what our restrictions are on now, but I need to go to our kind of guideline in how much public attendance we have to kind of set the parameters for what type of space we need. We have an ongoing about 75 public participants. I think even on this meeting we have 75, but we have actually hit the threshold of over 100, and so I don't know how we will be able to find a space.
So Sarah, that's what I had mentioned. You can do some homework and come back and tell us, no, it's not doable for reason A, B, C, and D.
I totally agree. I just, if everybody's listening now, if you know of a space, or I'd have to make sure that our state guidelines even allow for a public accommodation for at least 75 public participants plus the commission. That is our threshold now. So I just, want to manage expectations.
Okay.
That is our parameters.
So that makes sense. So I think we should wrap up this subject. So we'll do a 4-hour on the 21st of April with or without in person, depending on Sarah's homework. So having said that, I think we have future meeting dates. Any comments? We had a draft date schedule sent out by Sarah, I think, right, Sarah?
The commission agreed on this, I think a couple weeks ago, to do the monthly meetings every third Wednesday. I mean, certainly it's always been a challenge to get feedback from this commission on available dates. And so if this is not accommodating, or if this doesn't work for anyone, let us know. Otherwise, we are just going to move forward with making sure that we have monthly meetings third Wednesday of every month for the remainder of this year.
Does that make sense to everybody for right now?
Mm-hmm. Dr. Sonam?
Yes, somebody has a question.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Thank you. Sarah, if you could help us, given the priority for the Milbank work, help us at the next meeting to understand your capacity so that we know as a commission what other things and how much other things we'll be able to tolerate within the workforce capacity we have. That'd be really helpful. If you said this, I can only facilitate this plus one other subcommittee, that will be helpful in terms of how we help prioritize our work.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that thoughtfulness, and will do.
I'd appreciate that. So there's one question. I think it should be the last because we are at 12 o'clock. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. So, Commissioner Chair, I just had a question on when we initially talked about the every third Wednesday of the month, I think it was under the understanding we would only be in a 3-hour meeting. If we are going to go longer than that, I'm just going to say on the record, a Wednesday becomes more challenging for me as opposed to, and I hate to put this on anyone, as opposed to a Friday or a Monday. But just wanted to let you know. So I always assumed it would be a 3-hour period. So if we're going to extend that much beyond 3 hours, I would ask that we revisit the Wednesday date.
And what I could do, Chair, just for everybody's time, I will actually have Leslie circulate a kind of an email to the commission to revisit the monthly meeting schedule, accommodating a 4-hour window.
So why don't we repoll the commissioners? So that makes sense. So moving on, I think on the last agenda item, any public comment on North or South?
All right, commissioners. So members of the public, if you would like to speak in public comment, please raise your hand now. If you're on the phone, you want to press *9. We have a couple of public comments. Chair, I will allow the first person to speak. It looks like I have Miss Bethany Kahn.
Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Bethany Kahn, and I'm the spokeswoman for the Culinary Union. The Culinary Union is Nevada's largest organization of immigrant, Black, Latinx, AAPI workers, and women. I'm here today on behalf of the Culinary Union to ask that the Patient Protection Commission reflect the diversity of Nevada, include patients on its board, especially workers and people of color, and hear regular input from Black and Brown patients. We cannot have true healthcare equality and overcome current racial inequality and disparity without better representation in our voices. It's challenging to be a patient in need of critical care and navigate a complex healthcare structure, all the while dealing with the added pressure of systemic racism. As a woman of color, I've experienced many instances of healthcare disparity and racial biases in my medical care. The anxiety I feel when my life is in someone else's hands and the healthcare professional doesn't listen to me, discounts my pain, doesn't even look at me while talking about my healthcare, adds to my hesitation of even going to the ER every time. I'm often told, Bethany, you don't look like you're in pain, because as a woman of color, I've been conditioned to not be threatened, to not be aggressive, to be pleasant, and to just so I can survive. And as the daughter of immigrant workers, I know firsthand the difficulties my parents face navigating the healthcare system. My siblings and I often have to facilitate conversations which allow our elderly parents to be heard, get their questions answered, ensure that they're respected, and that my parents can get the care that they deserve. Workers of color would like to see our Patient Protection Commission be more representative of Nevada. That includes having more Black and Brown voices, including women of color, on this very commission, and that commission, including the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, address racial inequities in healthcare and regularly include the voices of Black and Brown patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that input. There's another person.
Yes. Mr. Welch.
Thank you. Bill Welch for the record with the Nevada Hospital Association. Just a few random thoughts. You guys had a very robust agenda. I appreciate the diligence and the input from all the commissioners today. A couple of things that I wanted to point out to the commission as we move forward with the APCD, as I heard Mr. Bailitt's comments, is the APCD would ultimately at some point in time be the basis for getting much of your data, not all your data, but much of your data. The way the APCD will work, it can only regulate that commercial carriers must submit the data. That pool of insurers only represents somewhere between 19 and 22% of payers in the state. Certainly self-funded plans or RISAs have the opportunity to opt in, and hopefully the majority of them will, so that we will have a more robust database to work from. Also, the state, including Medicaid product in that program, would also be very beneficial. With regards to the baseline, I just wanted to point out that, and I heard numerous comments made about Medicaid reimbursement. I hope as we begin to study costs, and I understand that it's driven by what the spend is, As we look at the various provider categories or payer categories, I hope that the cost for them to provide their services, one of the components that's looked at as to what is driving what they charge for their services, because that ultimately then drives what you spend for those services. So I think it will need to be drilled down beyond just spend if we really want to understand what is driving costs of healthcare in this state. With respect to Medicaid, I just want to point out that with hospitals, we talked about the physicians briefly, but for hospitals, Medicaid represents 26% of our patient population on an inpatient basis, and that's where the bulk of the cost is spent. We also rank 46 or 47, depending upon whose data you want to look at, on cost, on reimbursement to cost. We are one of the lowest reimbursed systems in the state. Hopefully we do not stay there. And I know that there's numbers of pieces of legislation being considered to look at how we can improve Medicaid reimbursements to all providers. So as you consider your baseline, if Medicaid, and again, Mr. Bailiff's comments said that initially, because we do not have a robust, we don't even have an APCD at this point in time, that we'd be looking at PEP and possibly Medicaid as the driving data components that we consider. I would hope that we recognize how low Medicaid is reimbursing providers, and that there is concentrated efforts to try to improve that. We cannot continue to support a healthcare delivery system with the percentage of our patient population being as high as it is and growing under the circumstances at this level. And hopefully our legislature does find a way to improve those rates. So that could have an impact on where, if we look at the data today and then we look at the data a year from now, if we are successful in improving Medicaid rates to providers. And then finally, I just wanted to thank Sarah for pointing out that the commission does have the ability, and I recall the governor's press conference when he announced the commissioners that he did appoint it, and acknowledged there were many applications of individuals wanting to participate on the commission, and it was pointed out by the governor at that point in time that this commission does have the ability to appoint other individuals in subcommittees. So I do appreciate Sarah pointing that out to the commission, and hopefully that is something that the commission will consider going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate those inputs. I think, and Aline, there is no other public comment, right, Sarah?
We have one more public comment.
Okay.
Actually, we have a couple more. Right now, I'm going to admit Jody Dominic.
Hello, my name is Jody Dominic. I am a nurse in Las Vegas. I am also a nursing educator in Las Vegas. I just wanted to add some considerations considering the nursing workforce issues in Nevada, that part of the nursing workforce is there are a lot of nurses leaving the workforce due to some of the staffing conditions that exist in the country. Is a lack of nursing educators, and there are lots of recent studies that present at a later date that show that there is a lack of nursing educators and away from admission to nursing programs as they're accepted due to nursing educator shortage. So I just want to present some of the issues for this committee to take care when they look at nursing issues.
Thank you very much. Next public comment person.
Sure, we have another one, but I'm not sure if it was just on my end or everybody else's end, but Jody, if you could follow up and give us your contact information and submit your testimony via email, I would like to get your statement circulated to the commission and then also put into our records. Okay, the next person is Salah El-Amin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Salah El-Amin. I just wanted to make a comment from a patient perspective. It's very difficult navigating the healthcare system, especially when you have to deal with different physicians. They seem not to talk to one another, and they want you to get all the information to present to the other doctor. I'm a veteran, so I deal with the VA because I couldn't, I just had a hard time navigating, but I do have a minor child and I have a elderly mother, and it's very difficult getting information from Dr. A to Dr. B and then making an appointment for Dr. C. It's just very, it's time consuming, it's frustrating. And I understand we have the HIPAA laws and, you know, we don't need to go into all that, but it's just very frustrating trying to get the information from one doctor to another. I just think it's, if some way we can mitigate that, make that a little bit easier, I think that would be helpful for just the everyday patient.
All right, thank you very much for that input. We have one more, Sarah.
Chair, it looks like that concludes our public comment.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Van Houten.
Nobody, great, nobody opposed? All right. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate your time.